So, abandoning the cave. Why this channel? Why the channel name? Hang on for a mind-blowing journey into the abyss of oligarchic evil, coming right up. I've spent a great deal of time on figuring out how to present this material with all unnecessary complexities that might obscure understanding stripped away, thereby making the subject matter more approachable. To do this, I've picked a known allegory in philosophy and a mythical creature from the past to get the point across in the simplest way possible. So what on earth is going on? What is the who, the what, the where, the when, and the why in all of this? Throughout history, after birth, a human being is ordinarily subjected to a process I have come to call post-birth golemization. This is something deliberately being done to us for the sole purpose of getting our perception bandwidth, you could say, narrowed down as far as possible to where you are perfectly manageable and just functional enough to be able to fulfill the underlying purpose in human society through whatever higher level capacity, also known as a profession, you have chosen to operate in. What is that role underneath your profession of choice then? You are to be a mere host for transgressive parasitic exploitation through tokenization of human time and energy as you toil your life away for the hidden central banking masters of the collectivist paradigm. So what is that token? And just who is this hidden master? That was described in great detail by Professor Carroll Quigley in his book on recent world history called Tragedy and Hope. On the first question on what that token is, here you go. Yes, a fiat currency bill, or a unit of authentic money for that matter, is essentially just a token representing unreplenishable human time and energy forever burned to earn these tokens, many of them for later transfer out of your hands, where some of it is then used to fund organized transgression against both yourself and others. This is why taxation and inflation, no matter the moral justification, is a transgressively violent parasitic robbery of life itself, as it's done to you under threat of violent assault conducted by armed order followers, the Agent Smiths of our world, you could say. They step in case of non-compliance with the demands of a legal contract you most likely never personally entered into, but were tossed into as a toddler by your parents as they traded your self-ownership for rights, benefits, and privileges assigned to a legal person, also known as a citizenship, owned by the state. That whole arrangement is about as morally defendable as cutting an infant in the crotch without its preceding consent, which it also, for obvious reason, cannot give in that situation. So, why is it going on and who has the upper hand on this? On this question, Professor Carroll Quigley, Bill Clinton's personal mentor at Georgetown University, teacher of the Rhodes Scholars and one of the most esteemed and well-credentialed historians of his entire generation, stated it flat out. Professor Quigley taught world history to the so-called Rhodes Scholars, and it's an entirely different historical reality being presented there than what lowly plebs have access to in regular public indoctrination. We get our perception deflected away from anything where the globalists don't want us to know a specific truth, because they know it would be unpopular with us. The first edition of the book was later subtracted in a damage control attempt as the work unexpectedly hit the mainstream. A second and of course watered down version without the juicy stuff then of course came out, but then a pirate copy of the first edition hit the market, and this led the publisher to re-release the first edition as a third edition to not lose out on the profits, as it now couldn't be contained anyway. There you go. I basically just gave you the exact identity of what many often refer to as the deep state or the military-industrial complex. In his book, Quigley also answers the justifiably puzzling question of why it is that the most powerful moneyed interests in the world support the propagation of socialism in the West. Why did Rockefeller support the Cultural Revolution in China? Why was the same attempted in the West with wokeness as part of their ongoing effort to convert the West into a white man's China? At some point, the Rhodes Roundtable players settled on socialism being the most inclusive form of collectivism there is, as the most suitable for Trojanization for the purpose of implementing a technocracy. It's the most suitable transitional ideology as it still enjoys the greatest degree of public acceptance despite the unbelievable volume of debt in its wake. Plain and simple. The world hasn't seen its last useful idiot yet. How does this pass under the radar of the general public? Well, allow me to elaborate on what I already hinted at with the difference between what carefully selected students of elitists' background are taught on human history contra what lowly plebs are fed. I need to start with the urban myth of the Golem of Prague. Because of the unpopularity of the Jewish community in Prague, a Kabbalistic rabbi produced a guardian creature in clay and proceeded to animate it with a magical rune placed on its forehead. In order to maintain control over the creature, the rabbi made sure it only knew the bare minimum required to be able to fulfill its role for its master. Because if it ever gained any greater insight into its own situation, it would just turn on its controller to kill him to be free. So the control of the golem was achieved by narrowing down its perception bandwidth down to the absolute minimum it needed for successful fulfillment of its assigned tasks. According to the story, the golem still exists in unanimated form in a synagogue attic somewhere in Prague, where supposedly no one to this day dares to enter. What is being done to us is what I call post-birth golemization, and it's being done for the exact same end, narrowing down our perception of greater reality to make us more manageable as we stumble around in our artificially limited tunnel vision, sufficiently dumbed down and just specialized enough to fill out the shoes of the roles we end up playing. And that finally brings us to Plato's cave. The cave was Plato's allegorical way of describing how societies can be and are being perception managed to obtain and maintain control of the subjects within them, without compromising their belief in being free-willed choice makers. But it only works as long as the target population doesn't know it's being done. It simply has to be an occulted effort or it won't work. This is key. Ergo, the reason why I've decided to do this channel. It's time to ditch the mental cave your brain has been tossed into. And now, the cave explained within the present-day context. First, you have human society, organized as a metaphysical space, a purely mental realm to contain human awareness by controlling human perception. On the left side of the wall, you have the chained denizens of the cave, the sadly deceived with no greater insight into what is really going on, as the fact has been insidiously compartmentalized away from their collective perception space. They are the normies of society, the democratic majority. Obscured on the right side of the wall, we have the transatlantic system complex of usually non-owned but 100% controlled entities like the central banking cartel bundled under the BIS, the tax-exempt foundations, the so-called non-profits and NGOs, investment operations like State Street, Vanguard and BlackRock, and outfits such as the various CFRs and institutes, the WEF, the IMF, UN, the EU, the World Bank, and many more. The complex is controlled in a neofeudalist fashion by an Anglo-globalist oligarchy rooted in a transatlantic system of think tanks often referred to as the Rhodes Roundtable system, which seems to be the neural network or distributed brain of the entire construct. They are the architects of deception and concoct whatever narrative required to obscure what they're actually doing behind our backs en route to their own end goal, being full-spectrum domination over all of human society globally. The globalists hold twisted silhouettes up in front of the narrative amplifiers represented by the fire in the cave. These are mostly compromised public and private institutions within democratic society, such as public education and mass media, corruptly groveling for grants and subsidies, compromised politicians, and opinion formers and intelligence operatives highly skilled in social engineering. The narrative amplifiers are the ones who generate the shadows on the wall, meant to deceive the denizens out of the manipulator's way, basically by metaphysically raping our perception apparatus as much as it takes. Then there is me, and perhaps you, the seekers, trying to clamber our way out of the cave in search of enlightenment after realizing our plight. Once we're up there, we're enlightened and will then have to choose. Do we try to help all those still down there suffering parasitic exploitation, or do we write them off?
Mark Curtis is an historian who writes on British foreign policy. His specialty is revealing long-forgotten official files.
I've certainly uncovered a lot of episodes where Britain has been either involved in coups or has been involved in military interventions that have appalling impacts on people's lives that simply never get mentioned. They're never referred to in the newspapers. They never get on TV histories of Britain. They're just taken out, basically. They're deleted from our historical memory.
Why does the public in Britain have such little idea of the sheer scale of this?
Well, a very large reason for that is that, if you look at every war or every coup or every regime that Britain is supporting or been involved in, it's usually accompanied by an increasingly sophisticated public relations operation by the government. We're told that British foreign policy is based on promoting democracy, on spreading development and promoting human rights. Well, if you read the actual government planning files, planners are saying to themselves that their policy is not based on that. It's based on the control of oil. It's based on creating an international economy that works in the interests of British corporations. And it's based on maintaining their great power status. This culture of impunity is deeply embedded within British society. If you go back, say in the 1960s, a time when Britain was covertly supporting an Indonesian military that was killing up to 1 million people, where Britain was responsible for depopulating the Chagos Islands, and where Britain was arming the Nigerian government that was killing hundreds of thousands of Biafrans in the civil war in Nigeria. All of that was taking place under the Labour government in the 1960s. And none of those ministers have ever been questioned. And yet those decisions cost literally millions of lives.
Khan Ross was a senior British diplomat at the UN responsible for imposing the embargo on Iraq. You gave evidence on the impact of sanctions.
Yes.
And this is what you said. The weight of evidence clearly indicates that sanctions cause massive human suffering among ordinary Iraqis, in particular children. We, the US and UK governments, were the primary engineers and defenders of sanctions and were well aware of this evidence at the time. But we largely ignored it or blamed all these effects on the Saddam government. Sanctions effectively denied the entire population the means to live, unquote. That's a shocking admission.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I stand by it today.
Why didn't you speak out during those 4.5 years?
There is a certain macho culture in foreign policy circles that to talk about things like humanitarian suffering when you're dealing with Saddam Hussein is a bit wet. You know, that it's not what the issue is really about, that governments do security, that's the kind of hard thing that we're there to provide. And I think however wrong your decisions may be, whatever damage you may do to other individuals, there is at the end of the day no accountability whatsoever. We had extraordinarily good resources to put together our story, to find little facts to justify their story, factoids I began to call them.
And how eagerly would journalists accept these factoids?
They had very little chance to do anything other than accept our version of events and more or less relay it unedited to the public. Government is an information machine, and we would control access for journalists to us, to governments. When I was in news department in the Foreign Office, we would control access to the Foreign Secretary as a form of reward to journalists if they were critical, if we felt they were too hostile to our account of events. We would not give them the goodies of trips with the Foreign Secretary around the world or exclusive interviews every now and then. We did the same in New York. If journalists were not particularly supportive to our account, we would freeze them out. We would make life harder for them. But there is a subtle and private relationship between them, which is basically of favoritism, that certain journalists are rewarded with access for being supportive of the story. They will basically tell journalists, you carry on with that line, that kind of unjustified criticism of our government policy on X, Y, or Z, we will punish you. And that is very explicit, those kinds of threats. What happened was not an intelligence-based process. It was basically a PR process run by Number 10 to produce a document that was much more politically credible than the evidence suggested.
It was a major deception, wasn't it?
I think it amounts, in effect, to that, yes. I remember before I was sent to New York in late 97, I did the round of departments in London saying to them, okay, I'm going to New York, I'm going to be doing Iraq, what do I need to know? And I went to see non-proliferation department in the Foreign Office, and I was expecting a briefing on the vast piles of weapons that we still thought Iraq possessed. And the desk officer sort of looked at me slightly sheepishly and said, well, actually, we don't think there's anything. We don't think there's anything in Iraq. I said, that's extraordinary. I mean, I thought we had sanctions because we thought Iraq had large amounts of weapons. He said, no. The justification for sanctions is basically that we have unanswered questions about how those stocks were destroyed in the past. But what I feel very guilty about it. I feel very ashamed about it. I feel ashamed about it sitting talking to you. You know, I feel actual shame running through my body when I talk to you about it.
Should journalists feel the same? Those who pass on the deception?
Absolutely. We should all be accountable to each other. I mean, I think that's the only way to have a civilized society, is some kind of transparency with each other and accountability, and people holding people morally accountable for what they do. And that applies to journalists as much as it applies to anybody.
The key takeaway is that whoever controls the expression of the shadows appearing on the wall also controls what the golemized majority of the human herd end up believing reality to be on any topic related to that shadow. This is key to understand, so here are a few examples to really cement it. But first, here's a sad truth from my experience, and it aligns quite well with a quote of the New England founder of the Gothic horror genre, the author H.P. Lovecraft. The oldest known emotion to man is fear, and the oldest known fear is the fear of the unknown. The fact is, most people are existential cowards who would rather continue to live the lie they know than turn around and find truth somewhere in the unknown. So, is the effort really worth your personal existential sacrifice and all the troubles you'll be facing? The fact is, because of this, the vast majority will resist you and not at all appreciate what you're trying to do for them. Conspiracy theorist, tinfoil hat, you think you know it all. Why this response? Because you become the ambassador of that unknown, which brings their inner coward up in them. And for that, they will start to avoid you, to shun you, to socially ostracize you. Are they really worth it? Well, I digress, but it is something to seriously think about. I will now present 13 real-world cases to demonstrate how the deception machinery of the cave works. Case 1. When the globalists, for their own clandestine reasons, wanted public opinion on the first Iraq war swayed to their own side, a silhouette of Iraqi soldiers pulling Kuwaiti infants out of incubators and then smashing their skulls against the hospital floor was held up in front of the fire for public consumption. This was actually a very reprehensible propaganda lie concocted by a US PR firm called Hill and Knowlton.
Fast forward again to August 2nd, 1990. Iraq attacks Kuwait, claiming the Kuwaitis are slant drilling into Iraq's oil fields. U.S. President George Herbert Walker Bush pushes for a land war against Iraq. But polls show the U.S. public is split 50-50 on that idea. Then comes this eyewitness testimony before a congressional committee from a 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl. The claim is she cannot be identified for fear of reprisals.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, took the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor.
The U.S. public is outraged. The result? Support for land war zooms. It's a turning point. Desert Storm is launched. 135,000 Iraqis are killed. An estimated 1 million Iraqis, many of them children and old people, then die as a result of 10 years of sanctions. One small problem. There never were any incubator baby deaths, not one. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's investigative flagship program, The Fifth Estate, reveals the girl to be the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, given her lines and coached in acting by the giant American PR firm Hill & Knowlton. It's one phase in a $10 million joint U.S.-Kuwaiti campaign of deception. This man is lying.
I myself buried 14 newborn babies that had been taken from their incubators.
This man is lying.
And they had kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
There were a lot of people who participated in a conspiracy. Yes, an out-and-out conspiracy of fake organizations, false documents, fraud, and disinformation. So, if a new man named Bush is in the White House and helps engineer a brazen deception in order to achieve global geopolitical goals, as well as domestic and personal ones, it wouldn't be a first, would it?
Case 2. When the globalists wanted to invade Iraq in the Second Iraq War, a silhouette of an Iraqi weapon of mass destruction was held up in front of the fire. But we all now know there was nothing. And still,
we have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
This is the perfect example of the collectivist principle of the ends justifies the means, the underlying rationale of justification driving all forms of collectivism, without exception. This principle in moral practice is the most common cause of death for humans worldwide, not cardiovascular and heart disease. Yes, the most common cause of death for humans worldwide is state. Case 3. When the globalists wanted public consent to destroy Yugoslavia, a silhouette of Serbs committing genocide in Kosovo was held up in front of the fire. The chief prosecutor at The Hague, Carla Del Ponte, has since admitted in her memoirs that there was no genocide in Kosovo. It was a lie concocted to serve the globalist agenda of destroying Yugoslavia, which the globalists consider to be a Russian outpost in Europe. Del Ponte was advised to subtract the book, of course, so as to not suffer a collapse of the still functioning shadow on the wall that people are still to this day basing their opinions on with regards to Yugoslavia. John Pilger, 3 times Pulitzer winner, exposed Del Ponte's insider admission on his personal website. The secrets of the crushing of Yugoslavia are emerging, telling us more about how the modern world is policed. The former chief prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia in The Hague, Carla Del Ponte, this year published her memoir The Hunt, Me and War Criminals. Largely ignored in Britain, the book reveals unpalatable truths about the West's intervention in Kosovo, which has echoes in the Caucasus. The tribunal was set up and bankrolled principally by the United States. Del Ponte's role was to investigate the crimes committed as Yugoslavia was dismembered in the 1990s. She insisted that this include NATO's 78-day bombing of Serbia and Kosovo in 1999, which killed hundreds of people in hospitals, schools, churches, parks, and television studios, and destroyed economic infrastructure. If I'm not willing to prosecute NATO personnel, said Del Ponte, I must give up my mission. It was a sham. Under pressure from Washington and London, an investigation into NATO war crimes was scrapped. Readers will recall that the justification for the NATO bombing was that the Serbs were committing genocide in the secessionist province of Kosovo against ethnic Albanians. David Sheffer, U.S. Ambassador at Large for War Crimes, announced that as many as 225,000 ethnic Albanian men aged between 14 and 59 may have been murdered. Tony Blair invoked the Holocaust and the spirit of the Second World War. The West's heroic allies were the Kosovo Liberation Army, also known as KLA, whose murderous record was set aside. The British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook told them to call him anytime on his mobile phone. With the NATO bombing over, international teams descended upon Kosovo to exhume the Holocaust. The FBI failed to find a single mass grave and went home. The Spanish forensic team did the same, its leader angrily denouncing a semantic pirouette by the war propaganda machines. A year later, Del Ponte's tribunal announced the final count of the dead in Kosovo, 2,788. This included combatants on both sides and Serbs and Roma murdered by the KLA. There was no genocide in Kosovo. The Holocaust was a lie. The NATO attack had been fraudulent. That was not all, says Del Ponte in her book. The KLA kidnapped hundreds of Serbs and transported them to Albania, where their kidneys and other body parts were removed. These were then sold for transplants in other countries. She also said there was sufficient evidence to prosecute the Kosovo Albanians for war crimes, but the investigation was nipped in the bud so that the tribunal's focus would be on crimes committed by Serbia. She says the Hague judges were terrified of the Kosovo Albanians, the very people in whose name NATO had attacked Serbia. Indeed, even as Blair, the war leader, was on a triumphant tour of liberated Kosovo, the KLA was ethnically cleansing more than 200,000 Serbs and Roma from the province. Last February, the international community, led by the US, recognized Kosovo, which has no formal economy and is run in effect by criminal gangs that traffic in drugs, contraband, and women. But it has one valuable asset: the US military base Camp Bondsteel, described by the Council of Europe's Human Rights Commissioner as a smaller version of Guantanamo. Del Ponte, a Swiss diplomat, has been told by her own government to stop promoting her book. Yugoslavia was a uniquely independent and multi-ethnic, if imperfect, federation that stood as a political and economic bridge in the Cold War. This was not acceptable to the expanding European community, especially newly united Germany, which had begun a drive east to dominate its natural market in the Yugoslav provinces of Croatia and Slovenia. By the time the Europeans met at Maastricht in 1991, a secret deal had been struck. Germany recognized Croatia, and Yugoslavia was doomed. In Washington, the US ensured that the struggling Yugoslav economy was denied World Bank loans, and the defunct NATO was reinvented as an enforcer. At a 1999 Kosovo peace conference in France, the Serbs were told to accept occupation by NATO forces and a market economy, or be bombed into submission. It was the perfect precursor to the bloodbaths in Afghanistan and Iraq. So, get this straight. It was perfectly fine for NATO to break its own charter rules and attack another country, a European one even, to stop a fictitious ethnic cleansing in a province there, but it was absolutely morally reprehensible for Russia to principally do exactly the same thing in response to an ethnic cleansing in a province that was actually going on, and where the elected leadership, Zelensky, had failed to stop it as promised during his election campaign. The extremely self-righteous double standard should be clear for all to see here. Pilger's description also makes you wonder why the Hague judges were so terrified of the Albanian Muslims in Yugoslavia instead of the monstrous Serbian Christians. It really does make you wonder, doesn't it? Possibly the Serbs had a very good reason for wanting the Muslims gone from Kosovo. Today, in several parts of Kosovo, the black flag of the caliphate can be seen waving. Perhaps, once again, we were made to assist the wrong side with our taxpayer resources because Russia. It certainly looks like it now in the rearview mirror. It also seems absurd that present-day Russia should be more dangerous to us in the West than Islamic supremacism, which is not just threatening to invade, but is already here, rolling over us like a tsunami, actively assisted in that by the roundtable. But I digress.
The change in Germany was of narrative, of discussion, was probably greater than any other country, but worldwide, that's not true worldwide. In Europe and the United States, in Euro-America, if you want to use that term, there was a basic change on the political left, which was that the political left went from being anti-war to being more pro-war than the right. It was the right, basically, that showed some caution here. And you began getting a switcheroo, you might say, ideologically, with regard to the issue of militarism. Germany more than elsewhere. But really, throughout Europe and in the United States, I saw this with my own eyes, and I remember it very clearly. People who had been anti-war just a few years before now were the most enthusiastic advocates of war because we're saving innocent people from slaughter. Okay, that was the narrative. And that was very appealing on the left. There was a religious fervor to it. I remember the religious fervor and an intolerance of dissent and open discussion and debate. That was very striking. It first began in Bosnia, and it really became into full flower in the Kosovo War. And so it was not just a German issue. I should have one more point about Germany that's of some interest, is that a major propaganda campaign was a claim made by the German Ministry of Defense that they had intelligence showing that the Serbs had a planned mass killing that was going to take place, and that was stopped by the NATO air campaign called Operation Horseshoe. That was the Serb name for it, Operation Horseshoe. And this was going to be a mass killing of Albanians, with some implication that it would be like a Holocaust of the Albanians. It was made up. And a German general later admitted the whole thing was made up. They never had any kind of intelligence pointing to this. And it was just a fabrication.
Here, the case of Yugoslavia, as elaborated on by former CIA intelligence analyst Larry Johnson.
You know, the pivotal year in all of this was 1999. Bill Clinton's president. Follow the timeline here. On March 12th, Bill Clinton welcomes in Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic as new members of NATO. Despite the Jim Baker previous promise under George H.W. Bush, did not move NATO 1 inch east. Instead, broke that promise. 2 weeks later, NATO attacks Serbia. And in attacking Serbia, it's a Russian ally. Russia tries to send some equipment, reinforcements to Serbia. NATO blocks Russia. Then jump ahead. August 7th, the Second Chechen War begins. The Chechen War, Chechens were a bunch of Sunni Islamic radicals. They brought in people connected to ISIS and other things and began attacking inside Russia. The Central Intelligence Agency was involved with supporting the Chechens. That was on August 7th. August 9th, 2 days later, Boris Yeltsin names Vladimir Putin as prime minister. And it's 4 months later, the end of December, Yeltsin suddenly resigns, Putin becomes president. What was happening is the Russians thought they could get along with the West, thought the West would be our friends. And instead of us bringing the Russians into NATO, we created Russia as a non-existent threat, but claimed it was a threat because our military-industrial complex needed to grow. They had to have an enemy, and by God, Russia was going to be that enemy.
So the roundtable oligarchy viewed Yugoslavia as a Russian-friendly bastion within Europe, and as such, it had to be destroyed. However, the globalists did not want the real reason for converting NATO into an organization of military aggression, instead of one of defense to be exposed to the domestic populations, as that might cause PR problems. So they invented a false ethnic cleansing in Kosovo to deceive the domestic populations into believing themselves to be in a righteous savior role when the attacking began. This piece of deflective deception made the domestic NATO populations victims of this perfect example of an inwards-directed fifth-generation warfare attack turn the blind eye when the globalists used our taxpayer-funded resources to assault and destroy another European nation-state, entirely in the private interest of the parasitic roundtable oligarchy that directs our political leaderships, mass media, and public education by clandestine means. Case 4. A silhouette of CO2 as a lethal poison gas is currently being held up in front of the fire. In reality, the causal relationship between CO2 and temperature is the exact opposite of what the shadow portrays. CO2 is essentially the gas of life itself, so being anti-CO2 is basically being anti-life. In my opinion, this is really about implementation of population control measures driven by a manipulative fear of death and guilt programming to establish majority consent among the golemized in the cave. It's also used to drive a further erosion of both our national and personal sovereignty, as well as a financial heist against both our national and private economies. The latter being a wealth transfer based on scientific fraudulence and institutional complicity, corruptly motivated by grant and subsidy fishing as part of a massive payoff scheme to get the roundtable narrative supported by experts. The chemical evidence presented still to this day hasn't been credibly refuted, and they can't do it with honest data either. Else, they would have done it long ago.
Former Vice President Al Gore's emotional film, An Inconvenient Truth, is regarded by many as the definitive popular presentation of the theory of man-made global warming. His argument rests on one all-important piece of evidence taken from ice core surveys in which scientists drilled deep into the ice to look back into Earth's climate history hundreds of thousands of years. The first ice core survey took place in Vostok in the Antarctic. What it found, as Al Gore correctly points out, was a clear correlation between carbon dioxide and temperature.
We're going back in time now, 650,000 years. Here's what the temperature has been on our Earth. Now, one thing that kind of jumps out at you is, did they ever fit together? Most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. The relationship is actually very complicated, but there is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer.
Al Gore says the relationship between temperature and CO2 is complicated, but he doesn't say what those complications are. In fact, there was something very important in the ice core data that he failed to mention. Professor Ian Clark is a leading Arctic paleoclimatologist who looks back into the Earth's temperature record tens of millions of years.
When we look at climate on long scales, we're looking for geological material that actually records climate. If we're to take an ice sample, for example, we use isotopes to reconstruct temperature, but the atmosphere that's imprisoned in that ice, we liberate, and then we look at the CO2 content.
Professor Clark and others have indeed discovered, as Al Gore says, a link between carbon dioxide and temperature. But what Al Gore doesn't say is that the link is the wrong way round.
So here we're looking at the ice core record from Vostok, and in the red we see temperature going up from early time to later time at a very key interval when we came out of a glaciation. And we see the temperature going up, and then we see the CO2 coming up. CO2 lags behind that increase. It's got an 800-year lag. So temperature is leading CO2 by 800 years.
There have now been several major ice core surveys. Every one of them shows the same thing. The temperature rises or falls, and then, after a few hundred years, carbon dioxide follows.
So obviously, carbon dioxide is not the cause of that warming. In fact, we can say that the warming produced the increase in carbon dioxide.
CO2 clearly cannot be causing temperature changes. It's a product of temperature. It's following temperature changes.
The ice core record goes to the very heart of the problem we have here. They said, if the CO2 increases in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, then the temperature will go up. But the ice core record shows exactly the opposite. So the fundamental assumption, the most fundamental assumption of the whole theory of climate change due to humans is shown to be wrong.
But how can it be that higher temperatures lead to more CO2 in the atmosphere? To understand this, we must first restate the obvious point that carbon dioxide is a natural gas produced by all living things.
Few things annoy me more than to hear people talking about carbon dioxide as being a pollutant. You're made of carbon dioxide. I'm made of carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is how living things grow.
What's more, humans are not the main source of carbon dioxide.
Humans produce a small fraction in the single digits percentage-wise of the CO2 that is produced in the atmosphere.
Volcanoes produce more CO2 each year than all the factories and cars and planes and other sources of man-made carbon dioxide put together. More still comes from animals and bacteria, which produce about 150 gigatons of CO2 each year, compared to a mere 6.5 gigatons from humans. An even larger source of CO2 is dying vegetation, from falling leaves, for example, in the autumn. But the biggest source of CO2 by far is the oceans. Carl Wunsch is professor of oceanography at MIT. He was also visiting professor in oceanography at Harvard University and University College London, and a senior visiting fellow in mathematics and physics at the University of Cambridge. He is the author of 4 major textbooks on oceanography.
The ocean is the major reservoir into which carbon dioxide goes when it comes out of the atmosphere, or from which it is re-emitted to the atmosphere. If you heat the surface of the ocean, it tends to emit carbon dioxide. So similarly, if you cool the ocean surface, the ocean can dissolve more carbon dioxide.
So the warmer the oceans, the more carbon dioxide they produce, and the cooler they are, the more they suck in. But why is there a time lag of hundreds of years between a change in temperature and a change in the amount of carbon dioxide going into or out of the sea? The reason is that oceans are so big and so deep, they take literally hundreds of years to warm up and cool down. This time lag means the oceans have what scientists call a memory of temperature changes.
The ocean has a memory of past events running out as far as 10,000 years. So, for example, if somebody says, oh, I'm seeing changes in the North Atlantic, this must mean that the climate system is changing. It may only mean that something happened in a remote part of the ocean decades or hundreds of years ago, whose effects are now beginning to show up in the North Atlantic.
The current warming began long before people had cars or electric lights. In the past 150 years, the temperature has risen just over 0.5 degrees Celsius. But most of that rise occurred before 1940. Since that time, the temperature has fallen for 4 decades and risen for 3. There is no evidence at all from Earth's long climate history that carbon dioxide has ever determined global temperatures. But if CO2 doesn't drive Earth's climate, what does? The common belief that carbon dioxide is driving climate change is at odds with much of the available scientific data. Data from weather balloons and satellites, from ice core surveys, and from the historical temperature records. But if CO2 isn't driving climate, what is?
Isn't it bizarre to think that it's humans, you know, when we're filling up our car, turning on our lights, that we are the ones controlling climate? Just look in the sky. Look at that massive thing, the sun. Even humans at our present 6.5 billion are minute relative to that.
In the late 1980s, solar physicist Piers Corbyn decided to try a radically new way of forecasting the weather. Despite the huge resources of the official Met Office, Corbyn's new technique consistently produced more accurate results. He was hailed in the national press as a super weatherman. The secret of his success was the sun.
The origin of our solar weather technique of long-range forecasting came originally from study of sunspots and a desire to predict those. And then I realised it was actually much more interesting to use the sun to predict the weather.
Sunspots, we now know, are intense magnetic fields which appear at times of higher solar activity. But for many hundreds of years, long before this was properly understood, astronomers around the world used to count the number of sunspots in the belief that more spots heralded warmer weather. In 1893, the British astronomer Edward Maunder observed that during the Little Ice Age, there were barely any spots visible on the sun, a period of solar inactivity which became known as the Maunder minimum. But how reliable are sunspots as an indicator of the weather?
Okay, bye. I decided to test it by gambling on the weather through William Hill against what the Met Office said was a normal expectation. And I won money month after month after month after month. Last winter, the Met Office said it could be or would be an exceptionally cold winter. We said, no, that is nonsense. It's going to be very close to normal. And we specifically said when it would be cold, i.e. after Christmas and February. We were right, they were wrong.
In 1991, senior scientists at the Danish Meteorological Institute decided to compile a record of sunspots in the 20th century and compare it with the temperature record. What they found was an incredibly close correlation between what the sun was doing and changes in temperature on Earth. Solar activity, they found, rose sharply to 1940, fell back for 4 decades until the 1970s, and then rose again after that.
When we saw this
correlation between the temperature and solar activity or sunspot cycle lengths, then people said to us, okay, it can be just a coincidence. So how can we prove that it's not just a coincidence? Well, one obvious thing is to have a longer time series or different time series. Then we went back in time.
So Professor Friis Christiansen and his colleagues examined 400 years of astronomical records to compare sunspot activity against temperature variation. Once again, they found that variations in solar activity were intimately linked to temperature variation on Earth. It was the sun, it seemed, not carbon dioxide or anything else, that was driving changes in the climate.
As the temperature clearly changes first and humans cannot turn the global temperature down to thereby causally reduce the global CO2 volume, all enacted climate policies targeting CO2 are, apart from being completely useless, also scientifically laughable and, in the end, a massive waste of taxpayer funds. But it sure is both financially and politically profitable for some, isn't it? Case 5. A grossly exaggerating silhouette of COVID-19 shaped as a mass death driver was held up in front of the fire to terrorize the populace into compliance with subsequent initiatives. It turned out to be yet another financial fascist heist targeting our tax resources as well as a stunt to generate fear-driven consent for further eradication of our freedoms. Never let a good crisis go to waste, as both Hillary Clinton and Obama's chief advisor Rahm Emanuel once put it. Hazardous mRNA chemistry was simultaneously deceptively presented as an angelic shadow of salvation, even though it's much more dangerous than COVID-19 ever was. Just like the rubbish narrative of man-made global warming still is, the entire COVID-19 scheme was driven by scientific fraudulence and, once again, institutional complicity, corruptly motivated by grant and subsidy fishing as part of a massive payoff scheme to once again get the globalist narrative supported by experts. We all now know, or at least we all should now know, that COVID was a gigantic nothing burger and that it even had a highly effective cure discovered only a couple of months after COVID hit the world in late Q1 of 2020. When the cure was discovered almost right after, the perception managers of the cave went to work again to have an almost demonically distorted shadow of the cure cast up on the wall, to make people shun it as something dangerous. It worked. Same thing was done to ivermectin when a shadow of it as a horse dewormer unfit for human consumption was cast up on the wall, even though ivermectin is one of the most commonly applied medicines to human ailments globally and with a fantastic track record too.
I do want to ask you about hydroxychloroquine. The president was pushing it pretty strong again yesterday. You said you have prescribed this. I want to talk to you about the effects you're seeing and what it might do for people who take it normally outside of coronavirus and a possible shortage of medicine for them.
Exactly. What we're finding clinically with our patients is that it really only works in conjunction with zinc. So the hydroxychloroquine opens the zinc channel, zinc goes into the cell, it then blocks the replication of the cellular machinery. So it has to be used in conjunction with zinc. We are seeing some clinical responses in that regard. There are people that take it regularly for other disease processes. We have to be cautious and mindful that we don't prescribe it for patients who have COVID that are well. It really should be reserved for people that are really sick in the hospital or at home very sick that need that medication. Otherwise, we're going to blow through our supply for the patients that take it regularly for other disease processes.
But what you're saying is you're prescribing it and it is working for COVID-19 patients.
Every patient I've prescribed it to has been very, very ill. And within 8 to 12 hours, they were basically symptom-free. And so clinically, I am seeing a resolution. That mirrors what we saw in the French study and some of the other studies worldwide. But what I am seeing is that people are taking it alone by itself. It's not having efficacy.
Okay. Wow. That's very interesting news. And hopefully we can get that more widespread. Dr. Anthony Cardillo, thank you so much for your information.
A Japanese study of 18 million vaccinated Japanese proves that you are much more likely to die early if you took the COVID shot. And the more shots you took, the more likely you are to die early too. Dying early can be as little as just 3 to 4 months after getting the last shot, as the spike in the graph from the study clearly shows.
そして3月29日、その呼びかけがあり、本日6月15日、なんと1800万人の接種回数、人数分、 のデータが蓄積されております。
者がオレンジで、接種者と非接種者を正確に比べようということをしてみますと、非接種者はね、山ができないっていうのは、これ当たり前なんですよね。打っても別になくなるわけじゃない、打っていませんので、何の問題もなく、フラットになるわけです。問題は接種者の方なんですけれども、緑のグラフ。それが初め低いんですが、1週間2週間は少ないんです、むしろ。で、1月ぐらいから山がですね、大きくなってきまして、3ヶ月、4ヶ月目にすごい山ができるということになるわけです。それでですね、これっていうのはどういうことかっていうと、おそらく、打ったお医者さんたちは、打った当日、翌日、1週間ぐらいに関して言うと、おそらくワクチンの影響だろうということで、副作用が発生した、副反応が発生して多分亡くなったということになりまして、PMDA にですね、送るわけですよ、その情報。ところが、1月、2月です。もう一つ。それからもう一つ、分かったことなんですけども、接種をですね、打てば打つほど山が前の方、左の方に、移動しているという現象も分かりまして、接種回数が増えていくと、死亡者の山の出現が早くなります。ということは、打てば打つほど死にやすくなると。より短い期間で、だから率が増えてくるということでありまして、それでまずですね、山ができる、で、ワクチン接種に毒性だとか死亡を誘導する効果がなければ、山にまずならないわけですよ。これがまず一つの発見で、打つ回数が増えれば増えるほど移動していくというふうなことは、打ったですね、毒性が重複どんどんしていって、回数が増えれば増えるほど早くなくなっていくというふうなことだと思います。
The study was spearheaded by one of the respected RNA experts in the country, Dr. Yasufumi Murakami, so he isn't just some fringe voice. He's a respected professor at the Tokyo University of Science, where he serves as a vice director at the Research Center for RNA Science. A well-respected epidemiologist by the name of Nicholas Hulscher, someone who is often used as an expert in real news, is estimating the total number of American mRNA vaccine deaths just so far to have surpassed the total number of deaths from World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War, all combined. Link in the description below. A sobering comment from Masayusa Inoue, Professor Emeritus of Osaka City University Hospital.
Thank you very much for giving me this valuable opportunity to send my message about a human rights abuse in the time of COVID-19. My name is Masayasu Inoue, Professor Emeritus of Osaka City University Medical School. My specialty is molecular pathology and medicine. The pandemic was used as a false pretext by the WHO to drive vaccinations of all peoples in the world. A plan was set up to shorten the time to develop vaccines, which usually takes longer than 10 years, to less than 1 year. Operation Warp Speed. This operation was used to cover up the misconception of the genetic vaccines. Under the pretext of saving time, an extremely dangerous method was selected, that is, intramuscular injection of viral genes to produce toxic spike proteins directly in human tissues to stimulate the immune system. Because this is a completely new method and misconception method that has never applied before in human history. It is impossible, therefore, for most of doctors to give proper informed consent. However, due to irresponsible government and media campaigns to promote vaccines, 80% of the Japanese has been vaccinated, unfortunately. 7 shots have been done so far. This is the most and worst in the world, and the result was the induction of the terrible drug-induced injury that has never seen in human history. I believe that the fraudulent use of experimental gene therapy to healthy people, particularly to healthy children, is an extreme violation of human rights.
The vast majority of all humans in the civilized world are now GMO. Yes, if you took the shot, you are now a genetically modified organism, and you therefore, technically, no longer qualify as a member of the Homo sapiens sapien species. You are something else now, all because of a mild flu that about 99.7% of all stricken only experienced as 5 to 6 days of the sniffle. It really was a scamdemic, as well as a vast crime against humanity, a crime for which no one is ever likely to be held accountable. Why? Because state itself was involved in the criminality, by its, once again, reducing of itself to a mere lackey of the always scheming roundtable interests. The golemized will usually apologetically in full Stockholm syndrome step in to defend its own violator, the state, only being a front for an even bigger and even more powerful violator above itself, the roundtable interests, and say something like, "But the state didn't know. It had to assume the worst for all of us." But that defense can only be applied for the first 6 weeks, as it then became clear that COVID was a giant nothing burger. After that point, there is no acceptable excuse for keeping on terrorizing the cave dwellers with the threat of imminent death and demonizing all those awake to the facts. But the perception management machinery of the cave did exactly that. The initial horrifying shadow on the wall was with corrupt deliberation kept unchanged in service of the roundtable interest to ensure continued compliance with later demands and recommendations, even though COVID had now been understood to be relatively harmless. Furthermore, the golems were terrorized into fearing, shunning, vilifying, and socially ostracizing all those who saw through the deception and refused to comply with the crime. This is taxpayer-funded state terror directed against domestic populations by roundtable-compliant puppeticians flanked by similarly compliant elements in both mass media and the sciences, acting in Faustian unison in favor of the most criminal and mass murderous interests of all in the world. How is that to be excused? No, this is absolutely unforgivable. The COVID crime against humanity is serious enough to warrant the complete and utter dismantling of the entire collectivist system complex we're pested with, never to rise again. And yes, mRNA also drastically increases the risk of developing cancer. The article with a PDF containing all the details from the US study can be found in the description below the video. Case 6. A silhouette of an oppressed woman in chains with an evil white patriarchy standing over her was cast up on the wall. But in reality, the state just wanted to double its tax base to be able to take on more debt with the central bankers, get kids out of the family hands to be able to indoctrinate them in public schools without parental interference, and to hammer a chisel down the nucleus family, as state institutions commonly view the nucleus family as the strongest institutional competitor to the state itself. In a collectivist society of centralized power, all families become a conspiracy against, quote-unquote, the greater good, as everybody prefers their own kin over everyone else's. So the war against the family is on. Feminism had and still has nothing to do with fairness, liberation, or equal rights and pay. It's a ruse for a very specifically targeted segment of society, women, and only fools buy into it at this point.
Kate Millett, she was an American feminist, author, and artist. She is the founder of the National Organization for Women. Her sister, Mallory, was invited to one of the first meetings that established the National Organization for Women. So this is a feminist group that has been around since the start of the feminist movement, and they basically pioneered the whole movement. And she opened the meeting with the following back and forth recitation. So this is how the beginning of the meeting went. "Why are we here today?" she asked. "To make revolution," they answered. "What kind of revolution?" "The cultural revolution." "How do we make cultural revolution?" By destroying the American family. How do we destroy the family? By destroying the American patriarch. And how do we destroy the American patriarch? By taking away his power. And how do we do that? By destroying monogamy. And how do we destroy monogamy? By promoting promiscuity, eroticism, prostitution, and homosexuality.
We have never invested as much in public education as we should have because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investments.
In the West, we've got another empire, which has grown out of a lot of earlier empires. And it's very heavily a financial empire, and it involves Bill Gates, and it involves the European Union. It involves Klaus Schwab, Soros, a lot of people trying to make billions of dollars and have a lot of control. And one of the things they want to do in the process, to tie this into your earlier guests, who really need to have the overview, is that they want to make us into transhumans. They want to make us into anything they want, essentially, to be able to exploit and use humanity, to cull humanity. And the whole gender business is about demoralizing us as individuals, giving us no rock-solid values, making us believe that you can be transformed by people outside yourself into some miracle new person. It's all about the politics, and the politics are the destruction of the individual, the family, the solid middle class, everything that has gone into our believing in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness rather than totalitarianism.
I think they actually have an intention, which is malicious. I think that this is planned. I think that there's a plan that encompasses movies, pedagogy in schools, the environmental activist groups that are trying to shut down electricity. Someone in my practice just came to me, a parent, and said, my daughter told me, Dad, why are you putting up Christmas lights? Don't you know that's going to destroy the environment? These are all connected. They're all connected. The end result of killing Christmas, of course, is that it destroys joy, which, of course, they don't want to have joy in our lives. But killing stories, killing electricity, killing differences between girls and boys, the whole transgender rights activism group, the environmental activism group, the pro-sensitivity crowd, and the writers in Hollywood, their underlying mission, it's all unified. All of the points that they're trying to accomplish are the same. They're trying to destroy our country. They're trying to destroy our way of life. They're trying to disempower people from making their own decisions and thinking for themselves, because they know that if they accomplish that, especially with young people, that the future is theirs, that they've captured a generation. I'm a child psychiatrist, and I think this generation is right on the verge of being captured. And once it is, there's nothing more that a parent is going to be able to do. Take away the parent, take away the rights of parents to make decisions, and what do you have left? You have a captured generation that defers to the teacher and the state and Hollywood and not to mom and dad.
For the left, public education is religious education. It's all about conversion. And here is, and most of the time on the left, they'll deny that, or they'll try to kind of use euphemisms. They don't want to speak directly about it and admit that, yeah, we want your kids. We want to convert them and make them into the kinds of people that we think they should be. Usually they skirt around that subject. They're not going to be so blunt and straightforward about it. But every once in a while, they'll come out and admit it. And sometimes do that in the form of song. So I got to play this for you to begin with. This is the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus, as they're called. And they've apparently been around for a long time. This is a video they put out on YouTube. It's titled A Message from the Gay Community. And anyway, here's the message. Let's listen.
You think we're sinful? You fight against our rights. You say we all lead lives you can't respect. But you're just frightened. You think that we'll corrupt your kids if our agenda goes unchecked. Funny, just this once, you're correct. will convert your children. Happens bit by bit, quietly and subtly, and you will barely notice it. You can keep them from disco, warn about San Francisco, make him wear pleated pants, we don't care. We'll convert your children. We'll make them tolerant and fair.
You probably thought that it couldn't get creepier than that. Well, it does. Here you go.
We're coming for them. We're coming for your children. We're coming for them. We're coming for them. We're coming for your children. We're coming for them.
Oh, nothing weird about that. A bunch of grown men saying, we're coming for your children.
We have this story from Town Hall. Hide your kids. Pride members state their agenda. We're coming for your children. In fact, this is actually a report from Timcast News. Our reporter Elad Eliyahu was on the ground documenting a Pride event when he captured on video a bunch of people chanting that we're coming for your children. This sparked a major controversy. The video's gone massively viral, but there's a lot more here that I want to address, which is why I'm leading off with this story. Because last Friday, we were graced by the presence of Emma Vigeland of The Majority Report, a prominent leftist podcast, where she explicitly defended giving children pornography and teaching them how to use adult gay sex apps. I appreciate that they're willing to come on, people like Emma, and explain these things to us, because it's very difficult when you're talking to people who don't know about what's happening in politics to tell them something like this that they refuse to believe. You see, it appears that the movements being made by the modern left today have reached into the realm of absurdity to the point where regular people don't believe it when they hear it because it's too shocking.
Ursula von der Leyen is obviously German, and we have a lot of these particular issues with the government romanticizing, glorifying the LG barbecue community, and completely hiding the fact that they are enabling pedophilia. And this is something that I've been calling out a lot in Germany, and especially some of my friends from the AfD, the opposition party. Vanessa Behrendt is a great example. She just recently hosted a child protection congress in Germany, and it's terrifying to see how it's particularly the left-wing parties that want to normalize stuff. Like we have public sex education pamphlets, guidelines that were introduced by the left and by the Green Party, where they encourage masturbation for toddlers, actual babies between 0 and 3 years old.
Case 7. Then there's the unprovoked aggression lie peddled by the roundtable and their lower-rank mouthpieces with regards to Russia and Ukraine. But, as usual, this is very far from the facts.
What's on your radar today?
Well, I want to share with you an article I read that paints a very interesting picture of the war in Ukraine. The piece was written by Jacques Beau, a retired colonel in the Swiss intelligence service who spent years as a military analyst for NATO and also worked as head of peacekeeping doctrine for the United Nations. He spent years in Ukraine working to build up the Ukrainian armed forces and analyzing Russia's involvement in the civil conflict in Donbass. Now, the article was originally written in French, but it's been translated by a couple of sources, and it's very long, detailed, and extremely interesting. So I encourage you to read it for yourself. However, I know most people won't, so that's why I want to go over it with you here now. So this piece isn't about what's happening now in the war. Beau says there's actually no real way to know, and anyone who claims they know is lying. He says the Russians actually have extremely good closed communication, despite what the propaganda claims, and it's impossible to really know what they're doing. This piece is a totally different perspective on why the war broke out. Now, many of us have heard about NATO expansion, Nord 2 pipelines, and land grabs, but Beau paints a different picture, and it's quite interesting. So Beau starts off by clarifying that the so-called Russian-backed separatists in the Donbass were not, for the past 8 years, supported in any way by Russia. He said a more accurate description of them would be to call them Russian-speaking autonomous, that they were not seeking to be separate from Ukraine, but instead to be autonomous within the framework of the country. After the overthrow of the elected government in 2014, one of the first things the new government did was remove Russian as one of the official languages of Ukraine. And this upset the large Russian-speaking population, caused uprisings, as well as emboldened the ultra-nationalists who began attacking and in some cases even massacring the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in various cities like Odessa, Mariupol, Lugansk, and Donetsk. The military started hitting back, trying to tame the unrest, and in the end, Ukraine has been essentially in a civil war since. Now, Bo was in NATO in 2014 working on fighting the proliferation of small arms. His team discovered that none of the weapons being supplied to the rebels were coming from Russia, despite some crude allegations. Instead, the weapons were being supplied by Russian-speaking defectors within the Ukrainian army. In fact, the defections became so numerous that it pushed Ukraine towards the Minsk agreement, both of the agreements, actually. After a couple of years, the Ukrainian military was in dismal condition. The population no longer supported them, and 70 to 90% of the reservists failed to show up for their recalls. Bo was then called up by NATO to help restore the image of the Ukrainian armed forces. Unfortunately, that's a long process, he says, and Ukraine ran out of patience. They then began folding into their ranks the ultra-far-right paramilitary militias we've all heard so much about, the best known being the Azov Battalion. Bo claims that by 2020, those various militias made up 40% of the Ukrainian forces. He describes them as fanatical and brutal individuals who are being armed, financed, and trained by the United States, Great Britain, Canada, and France. In fact, Israel became increasingly upset and alarmed by this. It's well known in Israel that many of these battalions are extremely anti-Semitic. Perhaps this is why Israel has been more reluctant to join in against Russia with the rest of the West and has even tried to broker peace in the conflict. It's doubtful they want to in any way be involved in the arming or training of these individuals. Now, Bo explains that the armed forces are broken into two groups. There's the official Ukrainian military operating the tanks, heavy artillery, and missiles. And then there's the paramilitary groups that are the National Guard. The paramilitary groups are tasked with urban warfare and defending the cities. He explains that it's strategically in the best interest of Russia to clear out the civilians from the cities so they can easily target the paramilitary groups. Whereas for the fanatical and brutal militias, it's in their best interest for the civilians to stay and act as shields. Bo explains that the start of the war and perhaps the real reasons for it is not well understood by the mainstream. He says it actually started a year ago when Zelensky issued a decree calling for the recapture of Crimea and began deploying his troops to the southern parts of the country. He said at the same time, several NATO exercises were conducted between the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, accompanied by a significant increase in reconnaissance flights along the Russian border. Now, fast forward to February of this year, and the Ukraine military began dramatically ramping up shelling against the rebels in Donbass. Bo says in his piece, quote, on 17th of February, President Joe Biden announced that Russia would attack Ukraine in the next few days. How did he know this? It is a mystery. But since the 16th, the artillery shelling of the population of Donbass increased dramatically. As the daily reports of the OSCE observers show, naturally, neither the media nor the European Union nor NATO nor any Western government reacts or intervenes. It will be said later that this is Russian disinformation. In fact, it seems that the European Union and some countries have deliberately kept silent about the massacre of the Donbass population, knowing that this would provoke a Russian intervention. Bo claims that prior to the intense increased shelling in Donbass, saboteurs equipped with Western equipment who spoke Polish were caught in the Donbass. They were allegedly seeking to create chemical incidents in Gorlovka, and that was in January when they were caught. Now, Bo says this intense increase in shelling and acts of sabotage were precisely how the Biden administration knew Russia would invade, that essentially the humanitarian situation was becoming so dire against the Russian-speaking population in Donbass that it was either stand by and watch them get massacred or intervene. He said they essentially gambled on Russia intervening. So this begs the question, if Russia was unwilling to get involved for the past 8 years, how bad was the shelling this last time? In conclusion, Bo says there are 3 reasons for this war: the expansion of NATO, which we're all aware of, the Western refusal to implement the Minsk agreements, which were agreements that gave the Donbass region autonomy while remaining part of Ukraine, and the continuous and repeated attacks on the civilian population of the Donbass over the past 8 years, with the dramatic increase in late February 2022. And he finishes off with some wise words. He says, quote, "We can naturally deplore and condemn the Russian attack, but we, that is, the United States, France, and the European Union in the lead, have created the conditions for a conflict to break out. We show compassion for the Ukrainian people and the 2 million refugees. That is fine. But if we had a modicum of compassion for the same number of refugees from the Ukrainian populations of Donbass massacred by their own government and who sought refuge in Russia for 8 years, none of this would have probably happened." So again, I highly encourage you actually to read the entire article. It sheds a completely different light on this conflict from someone who is not an American and yet still helped rally Ukrainian troops. He's not pro-Russia by any means. He's dedicated his entire career to NATO, the UN, and Swiss intelligence. I actually found out about it through Oliver Stone, who tweeted it out. Also, Aaron Mate with the Gray Zone has had a chance to interview Bo. And though I haven't seen that interview yet, I do look forward to watching it. So, Robbie and Brianna, what's interesting about this piece, I think the most enlightening aspect to it is, Bo points out that a lot of these aggressions were coming from the Ukrainian side toward Russia since last year. So they were saying, we're going to take back Crimea. They started amassing troops at the southern border. They then started to say that I actually, prior to the invasion from Russia into Ukraine, I'd been following the leaders, the military leaders, the generals from the Donbass region, the Lugansk and the Donetsk regions. And they had been, actually, you could see their videos. Well, I don't know if you can anymore. I think they've been removed. But they were saying, we are getting intelligence that the Ukrainian military is going to come into Donbass and try to do a hostile takeover of the region again. And so they were sounding the alarm when the U.S. was saying, oh, Russia's going to invade. The Donbass military leaders were saying, we're getting word that the Ukrainians are coming in and they're going to invade us in the civil war conflict. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you could technically call it an invasion if they're invading their own technical territory. But, look, the Western media wouldn't, I think, broadcast the fact that there's intense shelling coming in from the Ukrainian side to Donbass, or that troops are amassing at the borders and threatening to take back Crimea or the Donbass regions. So it's an interesting perspective coming from this NATO official who, again, spent his entire career focusing on Eastern countries and helping build the Ukrainian military. So I found that particularly interesting that we're not getting that side of the perspective. We've been hearing other reasons for the conflict, but this is an interesting one. An interesting new perspective.
The war started in 2014, and since 2014, NATO allies have provided support to Ukraine.
By the way, that's a big admission from him. He's saying that the Ukraine war didn't start in 2022 when Russia invaded. He's saying it started in 2014.
Yeah, why is he saying that?
That's correct.
That's crazy.
That's correct. Well, the part he's leaving out is that it started because the U.S. backed a coup in 2014. And then after that, the new coup government encouraged assaults on ethnic Russians inside Ukraine. And so those ethnic Russians in the Ukrainian region of the Donbass took up arms with the help of Russia to oppose the coup government. And then a civil war broke out. And the U.S. sided with the coup government. Russia sided with the rebels. And so, yes, there has been a war going on since 2014. And by the way, the side that the U.S. supported has an element of neo-Nazis. The Azov Battalion, a major paramilitary organization on the front lines of this war since 2014, are neo-Nazi. And so Stoltenberg there is inadvertently admitting what is exactly right, that this war didn't start when Russia invaded. Russia invaded to end a fight that began in 2014 when the U.S. backed a coup. And that's why in 2020, 2 years before Russia invaded, that's when Adam Schiff said that the U.S. aids Ukraine so that we can fight Russia over there. And what Russia did 2 years later was invade Ukraine to end that fight. And Stoltenberg now is inadvertently admitting that. And he's also pointing out that NATO's played a key role from the start since 2014.
Didn't start in February last year. The war started in 2014. And since 2014, NATO allies have provided support to Ukraine with training, with equipment. So the Ukrainian armed forces were much stronger in 2022 than they were in 2014. And of course, that made a huge difference when President Putin decided to attack Ukraine.
So here he is bragging about NATO's involvement in this proxy war from the start, which began in 2014, according to his own timeline. And here is Hassan Mafi. He says, NATO Stoltenberg, the war didn't start in February last year. The war started in 2014. Stoltenberg is right. The war started in 2014 when the U.S. illegally couped Ukraine and U.S.-backed Azov neo-Nazis started to massacre thousands of Donbass citizens. But the thing is, Stoltenberg has a hard time keeping with his narrative.
We're going to go back and tell our colleagues what Russia's up to in the Baltics, what they're doing in the Ukraine. We're going to get briefed about Georgia. We hope to make 2017 a year of offense. We believe that Putin has hacked into our elections in America, that he's trying to undermine democracy all over the world, and it's time for new sanctions to hit him hard as an individual, his energy sector, his banking sector. It is time to push back against Putin, but be a better friend to our allies over here, including Georgia.
And of course, who could ever forget this?
Free or die.
Free or die.
Now you are free.
Yes.
And we will be.
And the Russians are dying. It's the best money we've ever spent.
The only reason we all have to start fearing and hating Russia again is because when Putin ascended to power in the mid-90s, he put a stop to the now ongoing, highly criminal, parasitic, globalist usurpation of Russia, allowed to kick off by a highly compromised Boris Yeltsin. Ever since, the Roundtable has had it in for Russia and has been seeking conflict with Russia by one aggressively escalating eastward expansion of NATO after the other, in direct violation of a now proven verbal promise issued to Russia on the highest diplomatic level in the early 90s.
Again, just step back. We can look, it's documented what the size of the Russian army was. The Russian army was not increasing in size, it was diminishing in size. And yet the argument was, oh yeah, boy, we got to build up NATO to stop that Russian expansion. Or you've heard the other lie that's put out there is, Vladimir Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Empire. Well, Vladimir Putin's not the country with 700 plus military bases scattered around the world. That would be us, the United States.
On the highest level of the diplomatic system, a word is traditionally supposed to be kept according to its own internal code of honorable conduct. So, once again, the Roundtable makes unacceptable exemptions for itself and needs to be held accountable for it. But the shadow of Russia presented on the cave wall by the mind managers is that of an entirely unreasonable, monstrous behemoth that, for absolutely no good reason, assaulted Ukraine unprovoked on the 24th of February 2022. Case 8. In 2020, a silhouette in the shape of a fully competent and vigorous Joe Biden as the commander-in-chief of the US was held up in front of the fire. In reality, an unelected council of globalist fascists representing the Roundtable interests were running the show all along. This is who pulled Biden strings behind the scenes, according to a Biden insider, Lindy Lee.
What I will say is people were kept in the dark about the timing of the announcement, including the highest echelons of the United States government. For example, Anita Dunn, whom I worked in close concert with, had no idea. She did a conference call that morning telling people that we would stay the course, that they would stay the course. And so she had only like a minute heads up that the announcement was coming. And I can't stress enough how high up Anita Dunn was. She was basically part of the council of presidents. Dave, we didn't have a president in the past 4 years. Right. We had a council of these unelected people that you've never even heard of. And they're Anita Dunn, Mike Donnellan, and Steve Ricchetti. 3 of them were running the country. Most Americans, I would say maybe like 1%, if that, have heard of them.
The president reaches over just like this. We're sitting right next to the fireplace in the Oval, and he grabs my arm and he says, "The speaker and I just need a couple minutes together. Would y'all just leave us alone?" And I looked up on the faces of some of the staff standing around the wall, and they're like, "Oh, no, he did it." So he called it. He's the commander-in-chief. So everybody leaves, and he and I are standing awkwardly in the middle of the Oval Office, right over the rug by that coffee table. And I said, "Mr. President, thanks for the moments. This is very important. I got some big national security things I need to talk to you about that I've heard, and I think you know, and what do we do? But first, real quickly, Mr. President, can I ask you a question? I cannot answer this from my constituents in Louisiana. Sir, why did you pause LNG exports to Europe? I don't understand, liquefied natural gas is in great demand by our allies. Why would you do that? Because you understand, we just talked about Ukraine. You understand you're fueling Vladimir Putin's war machine because they got to get their gas from him, And he looks at me stunned with this, and he said, I didn't do that. And I said, "Mr. President, yes, you did. It was an executive order, 3 weeks ago. And he goes, no, I didn't do that. And he's arguing with me. I said, Mr. President, respectfully, could I go out here and ask your secretary to print it out? We'll read it together. You definitely did that. And he goes, oh, you talk about natural gas. Yes, sir. He said, no, you misunderstand. He said, what I did is I signed this thing we're gonna conduct a study on the effects of LNG. I said, no, you're not, sir. You paused it. I know. I have the export terminals in my state. I talked to those people this morning. This is doing massive damage to our economy, national security. It occurred to me, Barry, he was not lying to me. He genuinely did not know what he had signed. And I walked out of that meeting with fear and loathing because I thought, we're in serious trouble. Who is running the country? I don't know who put the paper in front of him, but he didn't know.
So-called real news across the board showed zero interest in the truth on this. Why? Because real news, being a large part of the fire in the cave, is a willing partner of the roundtable running frauds on human perception in service of oligarchic evil. Case 9. We were all told, and are still told, that Trump tried to whip up what essentially amounted to a fascist coup. That was the narrative for public consumption within the cave. But look at this.
Did they think this would be good for them? I'm shocked to see that CNN published a clip from a documentary filmed by Nancy Pelosi's own daughter of her admitting, quote, I've been waiting for this on January 6th, and then saying she's going to physically attack the president and go to jail. They believed that this would be good for them? I can't believe it. This October surprise, in my opinion, is going to implode in the faces of Democrats. Okay, what's the narrative they're trying to go for with this? That Donald Trump knew about the threats and the violence and the danger, and Nancy Pelosi was going, ooh, harumph, I say. Well, hold on there a minute, my friends. Why was Nancy Pelosi filming? Why did Nancy Pelosi have a film crew on her on January 6th? Nobody knew this was going to happen. No one knew. Or did they? Why was Nancy Pelosi's daughter filming inside on this day? Okay, fair point. Maybe it's because it was just a historic moment. It was a historic moment. Really? Okay, I guess. I just find it very strange that you have all of these things lining up together. Nancy Pelosi's daughter filming her. Nancy Pelosi saying, quote, I have been waiting for this, for trespassing on the Capitol grounds. That's a quote. And then her threatening to physically attack the president. Sounds to me like, here's what I think. I think they knew something was going to happen. I don't think they knew exactly what. I think there's questions about why the police were opening the doors. And now it's all coming together, isn't it? Conspiracy theory? No, I don't know the intent of anyone. I don't know what they thought would happen. What I can tell you is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez publicly stated that there are police inside helping the rioters, opening the doors. One video purportedly shows a mag-locked door. You can't open that. Being released, someone hitting the button. Videos of police officers taking selfies with people. Videos of police officers opening the door, saying, I don't agree with it, but I respect it. And then Nancy Pelosi saying, I've been waiting for this, for the trespassing on the Capitol grounds. And she has a camera crew with her. Do you want to buy a lottery ticket now? Because all of these things happening as a coincidence? No. I don't know that Pelosi was involved in anything. I'm not saying that Nancy Pelosi orchestrated anything. What I'm saying is probable cause now exists for subpoenas and an investigation into what exactly was she waiting for and why. Why was she waiting for trespassing on the Capitol grounds? That's an extremely specific thing to say that you're waiting for. Okay, well, let me show you the clip. Why even bother waiting? Here we go. This was played by CNN.
Secret Service said they have dissuaded him from coming to Capitol Hill. They told him they don't have the resources to protect him here. So at the moment, he is not coming, but that could change.
Oh, he comes, I'm going to punch him out. This is my mom.
I would pay to see
I've
that.
been waiting for this, for trespassing on the Capitol grounds. I'm going to punch him out, and I'm going to go to jail, and I'm going to be happy.
There it is. She says she's going to physically attack a sitting president. I'm pretty sure that's in and of itself illegal. I've been waiting for this, for trespassing on the Capitol grounds. What do you mean you were waiting for this? How were you waiting for this? Something doesn't make sense. Now, again, I don't know what that means, and I'm not going to pretend that simply because she said a sentence that we know everything about what happened behind the scenes on January 6th. What I can say is AOC implied it was an inside job. I mean, there's video footage of police opening doors. Come on. Doesn't that mean inside job? It doesn't mean that the Democrats or the government, it means there were police inside that opened the doors. Does it mean every cop? No. Here's what I think we need. We need Nancy Pelosi subpoenaed under oath by the January 6th committee. And I think this would be good for her. And she can answer exactly what she meant when she said she was waiting for this. And a few other questions. Ms. Speaker, why did you have a camera crew on this day? Simple question. And there's an answer. It's January 6th. It's the counting of the electoral votes. Okay, fine, I guess. But why did you then go on to say that you were waiting for this, for trespassing on the Capitol grounds? Put those two things together. She was waiting specifically for trespassing, and she had her daughter filming all day. Let's go back in time. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She goes live on Instagram, and she tells a story about hearing a knocking on her door. And then she panics. Oh no. And she goes and hides in her bathroom. And then someone comes in the room and she hears, where is she? Where is she? And she's thinking, the rioters, they found me. Fortunately, it was just a cop who terrified her. And this all happened on January 6th. The only problem with that narrative, and I was surprised a lot of people didn't catch this, was that her story took place a full hour before anyone breached the Capitol grounds, before anyone breached the building, before anyone had known that anything was going to happen. AOC comes out with this story. I don't understand. AOC, maybe she's lying. Maybe. I will say as a statement of fact, AOC lied. And now we have this from Nancy Pelosi. Yo, this is massive. You gotta tell people about this. I don't know what they were expecting from this. That Nancy Pelosi would come out and admit she brings in a film crew and then admits she was waiting for trespassing. That is so insanely specific. That is too specific. It's one thing if you were like, we're here to film a historic moment. Oh no, trespassing is happening. If it's another thing to be like, I got a film crew with me. This is the moment I've been waiting for, trespassing. What? I don't know that there was any orchestration. What I can say is, at the very least, one thing you can say, Nancy Pelosi, based on that statement, had her fingers crossed, just hoping, please, trespass. That's insane. Maybe that's why the police didn't do anything. Maybe that's why many of the police opened the doors. And maybe that's why once they got inside, one police officer murdered a woman. I don't exactly know if this video from DC Drano is one of the videos that was given to Tucker Carlson, but it shows something interesting. It shows what appears to be a man who is likely some kind of law enforcement or nefarious actor wearing an earpiece, pulling people into the building against their will, and a woman saying, no, you pulled us in. Interesting. Well, here's the tweet from DC Drano. Nothing to see here. Just a guy wearing an earpiece physically forcing people inside the Capitol on January 6th and a woman calling him out on it. I'm sure he wasn't a federal agent of any kind. This is why they don't want more video footage released. Well, let me play this video for you, and we'll see what's going on. Here you can see right here. This guy's pulling people in. Stop, no, you pushed us in. You were pushing us in. And here's the guy, now seen on the ground from a different angle, wearing an earpiece. The man said she pushed her. The man she said pushed her in was wearing an earpiece. I have to be honest. It almost seems pointless to do segments about these two news stories from the end of last week. One from KansasCity.com. Video shows 3 police officers apparently join January 6th protests filing in Kansas case says. I would just like to give a shout out to our good friends over at kansascity.com, NewsGuard certified, of course, for putting that comma, filing in Kansas case says. There's video of police officers, MPD, these are Metropolitan DC police, inciting people to go, 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 and do more. And that's the point, isn't it? They were not just collecting information or acting as undercover operatives in evidence-gathering missions or whatever. They were actively inciting people to commit crimes.
And this.
Here, of course, former President Trump was completely denied any such opportunity. And it turns out there is significant reason to doubt the evidence the House managers have put before us. Let me say this clearly. We have reason to believe the House managers manipulated evidence and selectively edited footage. If they did, and this were a court of law, they would face sanctions from the judge. I don't raise this issue lightly. Rather, it is a product of what we have found in just the limited time we have had since we first saw the evidence here with you this week. We have reason to believe that the House managers created false representations of tweets, and the lack of due process means there was no opportunity to review or verify the accuracy. Consider these facts. The House managers, proud of their work on this snap impeachment, staged numerous photo shoots of their preparations. In one of those, Manager Raskin is seen here at his desk reviewing two tweets side by side. The image on his screen claims to show that President Trump had retweeted one of those tweets. Now, members of the Senate, let's look closely at this screen, because obviously Manager Raskin considered it important enough that he invited the New York Times to watch him watching it. Now, what's wrong with this image? Actually, there are three things very wrong with it. Look at the date on the very bottom of the screen on Manager Raskin's computer screen when we zoom into the picture. The date that appears is January 3rd, 2020, not 2021. Why is that date wrong? Because this is not a real screenshot that he's working with. This is a recreation of a tweet, and you got the date wrong when you manufactured this graphic. You did not disclose that this is a manufactured graphic and not a real screenshot of a tweet. Now, to be fair, the House managers caught this error before showing the image on the Senate floor, so you never saw it when it was presented to you. But that's not all. They didn't fix this one. Look at the blue check mark next to the Twitter username of the account retweeted by the president. It indicates that this is a verified account, given the blue check by Twitter to indicate it is run by a public figure. The problem? The user's real account is not verified and has no blue check mark, as you can see. Were you trying to make her account seem more significant, or were you just sloppy? If we had due process of law in this case, we would know the truth. But that's not all that's wrong with this one tweet. House Manager Swalwell showed you this tweet this week, and he emphasized that this tweet reflected a call to arms. He told you repeatedly that this was a promise to call in the cavalry for January 6th. He expressly led you to believe that President Trump's supporter believed that the president wanted armed supporters at the January 6th speech, paramilitary groups, the cavalry, ready for physical combat. The problem is, the actual text is exactly the opposite. The tweeter promised to bring the Calvary, a public display of Christ's crucifixion, a central symbol of her Christian faith, with her to the president's speech, a symbol of faith, love, and peace. They just never want to seem to read the text and believe what the text means. You'll see this reported in the media last evening also. Words matter, they told you, but they selectively edited the president's words over and over again. They manipulated video, time-shifting clips, and made it appear the president's words were playing to a crowd when they weren't. Let's take a look.
After this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down to the Capitol. But I think right here, we're going to walk down to the Capitol. And we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. And we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them. Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong. We have come to demand that Congress do the right thing and only count the electors who have been lawfully slated. Lawfully slated. I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
And we are going to walk down to the Capitol. They showed you that part. Why are we walking to the Capitol? Well, they cut that off. To cheer on some members of Congress and not others, peacefully and patriotically. The Supreme Court ruled in Brandenburg that there's a very clear standard for incitement. In short, to paraphrase, whether the speech was intended to provoke imminent lawless action, and was it likely to do so. Go to the Capitol and cheer on some members of Congress, but not others. They know it doesn't meet the standard for incitement, so they edited it down. We heard a lot this week about fight like hell, but they cut off the video before they showed you the president's optimistic, patriotic words that followed immediately after.
Fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Our exciting adventures and boldest endeavors have not yet begun. My fellow Americans, for our movement, for our children, and for our beloved country. And I say this, despite all that's happened, the best is yet to come.
There's that famous quote, like one of the House managers said, a lie will travel halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to put its shoes on. Well, this lie traveled around the world a few times, made its way into the Biden campaign talking points, and ended up on the Senate floor. The Charlottesville lie. Very fine people on both sides, except that isn't all he said. And they knew it then, and they know it now. Watch this.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group, excuse me, I saw the same pictures as you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name. No, George Washington was a slave owner. Was George Washington a slave owner? So will George Washington now lose his status? Are we going to take down, are we going to take down statues to George Washington? How about Thomas Jefferson? What do you think of Thomas Jefferson? You like him? Okay, good. Are we going to take down the statue? Because he was a major slave owner. Now we're going to take down his statue. So you know what? It's fine. You're changing history. You're changing culture. And you had people, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally. But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists, okay? And the press has treated them absolutely unfairly. Now, in the other group also, you had some fine people, but you also had troublemakers, and you see them come with the black outfits and with the helmets and with the baseball bats. You had a lot of bad people in the other group too.
Unfairly, sir, I'm sorry. I just didn't understand what you were saying. You were saying the press has treated white nationalists unfairly?
No,
I just didn't understand what you were saying.
No. There were people in that rally, and I looked the night before. If you look, there were people protesting very quietly the taking down of the statue of Robert E. Lee. I'm sure in that group there were some bad ones. The following day, it looked like they had some rough, bad people. Neo-Nazis, white nationalists, whatever you want to call them. But you had a lot of people in that group that were there to innocently protest and very legally protest because, I don't know if you know, they had a permit. The other group didn't have a permit. So I only tell you this. There are two sides to a story. I thought what took place was a horrible moment for our country, a horrible moment. But there are two sides to the country. Does anybody have a final? Does anybody have, you have an infrastructure. What makes you think?
This might be today the first time the news networks played those full remarks in their context. And how many times have you heard that President Trump has never denounced white supremacists? Now you in America know the truth. Here's another example. One of the House managers made much of the president's supposedly ominous words of, "You have to get your people to fight." But you knew what the president really meant. He meant that the crowd should demand action from members of Congress and support primary challenges to those who don't do what he considered to be right. Support primary challenges, not violent action. I know what he meant because I watched the full video, and so did the House managers, but they manipulated his words. You will see where they stopped it, and to give it a very different meaning from the meaning it has in full context. Let's watch.
You have to get your people to fight. He told them.
You have to get your people to fight. And if they don't fight, we have to primary the hell out of the ones that don't fight. You primary them. We're gonna let you know who they are. I can already tell you, frankly.
The people who need to fight are members of Congress. Why did we have to skip the necessary due diligence and due process of law and any legal proceeding should have? It couldn't have been the urgency to get President Trump out of office. House Democrats held the articles until he was no longer president, mooting their case. Hatred, animosity, division, political gain, and let's face it, for House Democrats, President Trump is the best enemy to attack.
The only people who ever actually tried to coup the US to then turn it into a fascist dictatorship was the Rhodes Roundtable, now puppeteering both sides of the established officialdom on both sides of the pond and in many, many other areas of the world as well.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government. I talked with an investigator for this committee who came to me with a subpoena on Sunday, November 18th. He told me they had unearthed evidence linking my name with several such veteran organizations. As it then seemed to me to be getting serious, I felt it was my duty to tell all I knew of such activities to this committee. My main interest in all this is to preserve our democratic institution. I want to retain the right to vote, the right to speak freely, and the right to write. If we maintain these basic principles, our democracy is safe. No dictatorship can exist with suffrage, freedom of speech, and press.
No one was ever held accountable. Later, the Roundtable achieved the coup by the back door, and the establishment politicians of today are only panicking because it's afraid that Trump-controlled opposition, one way or the other or not, might cancel their grand achievement, which is the real reason why we all have to hate Trump inside the globalist Plato cave. Exactly how this slow-motion state coup of the US was performed and for what end is explained in the book based on the Reece Committee report called Foundations, Their Power and Influence by Renee A. Wormser. Not that this next clip will drive you crazy, but Mr. Dodd's personal assistant in the investigation, Catherine Casey, was actually driven insane by what she uncovered at the Carnegie Endowment, so this whole area of study is not for the faint of heart. When you begin really studying the Roundtable, at some point you realize that what you're actually studying is evil itself in political practice, and that gets you staring into the abyss of psychopathy in very high resolution, which is not for everybody. Just a friendly warning from me to you. Not trying to dramatize here, it's really that bad. When you reach a certain level of insight on this topic, you will never be the same either. It's only a matter of how much and how badly it changes you.
what we had uncovered was the determination of these large endowed foundations through their trustees to actually get control over the content of American education.
There's quite a bit of publicity given to your conversation with Rowan Gaither. Would you please tell us who he was and what was that conversation you had with him?
Rowan Gaither was at that time president of the Ford Foundation. And Mr. Gaither had sent for me when I found it convenient to be in New York, asked me to call upon him at his office, which I did. And on arrival, after a few amenities, Mr. Gaither said, "Mr. Dodd, we've asked you to come up here today because we thought that possibly off the record you would tell us why the Congress is interested in the activities of foundations such as ourselves." And before I could think of how I would reply to that statement, Mr. Gaither then went on voluntarily and stated, he said, "Mr. Dodd, all of us that have a hand in the making of policies here have had experience either with the OSS during the war or the European Economic Administration after the war. We've had experience operating under directives, and these directives emanate and did emanate from the White House. Now, we still operate under just such directives. Would you like to know what the substance of these directives is?" And I said, "Yes, Mr. Gaither, I'd like very much to know." Whereupon he made this statement to me, namely, "Mr. Dodd, we here operate on in response to similar directives, the substance of which is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union." Well, parenthetically, Mr. Griffin, I nearly fell off the chair. I, of course, didn't, but my response to Mr. Gaither then was, "Well, Mr. Gaither, I can now answer your first question. You forced the Congress of the United States to spend $150,000 to find out what you just told me. So why don't you I said, "Of course, legally, you're entitled to make grants for this purpose. But I don't think you're entitled to withhold that information from the people of the country to whom you're indebted for your tax exemption. So why don't you tell the people of the country that's what you told me?" And his answer was, "We would not think of doing any such thing." So then I said, "Well, Mr. Gaither, obviously, you forced the Congress to spend this money in order to find out what you just told me."
A link to the full interview with Norman Dodd, the congressional investigator spearheading the Reece Committee investigation, can be found in the description below the video. Case 10. In what appears to be a classic false flag attack, albeit a failed one, the Roundtable State of Israel attacked an unarmed U.S. Navy ship and killed 34 U.S. sailors with full deliberation. The U.S. reaction? Cover up, not retaliation. Former mainstream media journalist Clayton Morris has interviewed neglected survivors of the Roundtable's attack on the USS Liberty and had the following to say about it to Tucker Carlson.
False flags are very useful.
Yeah, I know.
Very useful. And they work.
I know.
They work, sadly. USS Liberty. USS Liberty, a famous false flag. You want to get us in the war against Egypt? Well, then Israel and the CIA collaborate and bomb and kill American sailors on the USS Liberty. Too bad you didn't kill all of them, because a lot of them lived, and they told the world what the hell happened when they tried to use American sailors as a false flag to get us into a war against Egypt. Didn't work. even though Lyndon Johnson and the CIA tried their damnedest to work with Israel to do it.
So you think Lyndon Johnson knew that American sailors were being murdered?
100%. It goes all the way to him. You could read Blood in the Water, Joan Mellon's incredible book.
That is so evil that I can't even...
He's such an evil human being. Such an evil human being. But don't ask Doris Kearns Goodwin that, because, she'll write a book about how amazing he is. But he was an evil son of a bitch. And he knew. In fact, and wouldn't allow them to be rescued, by the way. Not only knew about it, but wouldn't allow them to be rescued. They hoped that every American died in the waters that day. But they didn't.
Lyndon Johnson knew this.
Yes. He knew it. And
well, I think he's paying for that right now.
Yeah, you would hope.
Yeah.
And a lot of other people knew it too in the CIA. So I love when people today...
some poor American sailors on a surveillance ship, not lightly armed, not really armed. I think they had like
it was a spy ship.
Yeah.
With massive American flags on the deck. We're a friendly ship. And the Israelis knew it. They had it in their control room on the wall. Friendly. They knew it. And the scout ships that were flying that morning knew it. So it's a lie that it was a mistake. It was not a mistake. We have the documents. We know that it wasn't a mistake. It was intentional.
But I didn't realize, I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
And you're not allowed to say it for some reason.
No, you can't say it. Like, these are things that you're not allowed to talk about.
Right. You can criticize the U.S. government, but,
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I will say, it infuriates me that you can criticize your own government, but not a foreign government. That's so grotesque. On the other hand, you also give any foreign government a pass if it's acting in its own interest. It's like, they don't care about you. You're a foreign country. Right. I get it. But the idea of our country allowing the murder of our own sailors who did nothing wrong, were sent there, by the way, conscripted. We had the draft then.
Yeah.
Maybe not even there voluntarily.
It's a great point.
That the U.S. government knows that? My head is, I didn't know that until
he was told with urgency to get there and to be put in position. And he was like, why am I being put in a position like in a kill zone? Like, why can I go another mile offshore when I'll be safe? No, you need to be right in this spot.
So the Pentagon set it up?
Oh, yeah. The CIA
them to be killed.
The CIA collaborated with the Israeli government and maneuvered a U.S. ship to this position to be killed, to be destroyed. The mission was for it to be totally destroyed. So you don't have people coming on my show just telling you what they saw that day. Like, they all were supposed to be dead.
Case 11. We were told that we had to go into Syria as a part of the so-called war on terror because of this new group of Islamic fundamentalists called ISIS, later IS, was nesting out there. In reality, the globalists clandestinely placed ISIS there themselves after first having used the same people against Gaddafi in Libya. They were mainly transported through Turkey for the purpose. The intent was to use the caliphate as a proxy force to fight the Syrian army, while pretending to Western taxpayers that the official reason given was the truth. The globalists basically did exactly the same in Syria with lunatic Muslims to fight Assad that they later did in Ukraine as well with Nazis to fight Russian interests there. Even after it became clear that the caliphate was committing unspeakable barbaric atrocities against minorities in Syria, mainly against Yazidis and Alawites, globalist politicians, on behalf of their roundtable overlords in the private sector, still kept on supporting the caliphate with training and equipment corruptly financed by taxpayers. The entire operation was called Operation Timber Sycamore, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Al-Nusra Front, and several other moderate rebels have just been a proxy tool of the roundtable all along. They were never the enemy. This is yet another perfect example of a false narrative being peddled as reality within the cave, while the truth is kept out of it. Today, a former Al-Qaeda commander and an absolute barbarian and Zionist ally named al-Jilani is the official head of state in Syria, fully supported by the Roundtable and its Western minions, including Trump, even as the ethnic cleansing against primarily Christians has once again picked up steam. Tell me again how bad Putin is.
I think it's important for us to understand where this entire war came from. It did not come from Bashar al-Assad. It came from Washington. There was a decision in 2011 to overthrow Assad. Actually, that came from Jerusalem. This has been a desire of the Israeli government that stretches back more than 25 years. Netanyahu's idea is make the Middle East in Israel's image, overthrow every government that opposes Israel. He's had a friend in that, and that is the CIA and the United States government. So this war in Syria did not come from Assad's repression. It did not come from Assad's dictatorship. This war came from a presidential order by Obama to overthrow Assad, starting in the spring of 2011. We have a name for this program. It was Operation Timber Sycamore. The United States, together with other countries in this region, trained fighters, especially jihadists, including the ones that just took power, to overthrow the regime. This created chaos. 600,000 dead in Syria in a war that has gone on for 14 years. The outcome of this war is what the CIA wanted back in 2011, which is that a jihad group would take power in Syria after being armed by the United States. The reason I want to be clear about this is that we will not have peace in this region until we have public diplomacy that is based on real diplomacy, not on CIA operations. And we will not have peace until Israel stops its militarization of the entire Middle East, because the Syrian war is just one of 6 wars that Israel has promoted, including in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Somalia, and Sudan. We had the list, actually, from Wesley Clark back in 2001, when he was handed a paper in the Pentagon that the goal was 7 wars in 5 years. The only war that hasn't taken place yet, to Netanyahu's great consternation, is the US war with Iran, which Israel is still trying to instigate to this very day. So the Syrian war is part of a regional tragedy. We have tragedy in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Sudan, South Sudan, and Libya that I put at the hands of the United States government and its ally Israel, because none of these wars had to happen. These were all wars of choice. They were all wars that came from the idea of regime change operations, that the United States would determine which regimes operate in which countries. We'll never have peace in this region if outside imperial powers like the United States are dictating the terms to this region. The only way to have peace in this region is if this region is determining its own future, not outside powers. And Israel could never do these wars on its own. These are American wars. America provides the financing, it provides the military backup, it provides the naval support, it provides the intelligence operations, it provides the munitions. Israel couldn't fight for 1 day without the United States backing. Israel could not be committing a genocide in Gaza without the United States' full operational complicity. I don't mean political complicity, I mean direct, daily operational complicity. This has to end. This region has been divided for 100 years, first by the British Empire and then by the American Empire. And this is going on until today. We have a genocide going on right next door. Till today, till this morning. People being wantonly killed, brazenly killed, because the United States is providing the means for this. So this is what's happening in Syria. Is the U.S. on the fence? Hardly. It's the major actor. I know, by the way, I know firsthand that in 2012, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appointed former Secretary General Kofi Annan as a special envoy to reach a peace in Syria. I loved Kofi Annan. I love Ban Ki-moon. I worked for both of them. Kofi Annan arranged a peace in 2012. He arranged a peace in Syria. You know why it didn't happen? Because all the parties agreed to peace except one. Literally one. That was the United States of America. The United States of America said there will be no peace unless Bashar al-Assad goes the first day. The other parties said, no, you can't just determine that. Maybe there'll be a process. Maybe there'll be elections agreed. Maybe there'll be a 2-year process, a 3-year process. The United States said, no, Assad must go the first day of any agreement or we block it. And so Kofi Annan stepped down from his position after having negotiated a peace arrangement, and we have had 500,000 people dead since then. We should not allow this kind of criminality to be normal. This region has been at war nonstop for 30 years. Actually, I would say for at least 57 years since the Six-Day War, because there has been no honest accounting of international law, no honest diplomacy. It's been militarization all the way through. And we could have peace immediately in this region. All that is required, in my view, is the United States change its veto of Palestine as the 194th UN member state, because on that basis, all the region would normalize relations and the wars all across this region would stop. But Israel has had control over US policy, and it says no. It wants greater Israel. It wants Israel in Syria. It wants Israel in Lebanon. It wants Israel in the West Bank. It wants Israel in East Jerusalem. It wants Israel in Gaza. And until that stops, we're not going to have peace. So is the U.S. on the fence? Of course not. It's the major protagonist of this whole war and has been for the last 14 years.
Former General Secretary of NATO and 4-star U.S. General Wesley Clark.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who had used to work for me. And one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." I said, "Is it classified?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Well, don't show it to me." And I saw him a year or so ago, and I said, "You remember that?" He said, Sorry, I didn't show you that memo. I didn't show it to you.
I'm sorry, what did you say his name was?
I'm not going to give you his name.
So we're now clearly getting into Iran in that plan. It took a little longer than 5 years, but they're still trucking on with it. Case 12. To this day, globalist tools of the roundtable still claim that Russia one day just decided to assault Georgia for no good reason, just like Ukraine. But here's the truth.
But that wasn't all. In 2003, the Georgian government was also overthrown by a US-backed color revolution known as the Rose Revolution. Like in Ukraine, it threw out a government that was friendly to Russia and installed one that was pro-NATO. Between 2003 and 2008, the US began arming and training Georgia to engage in war with Russia.
What's the point of all of this?
Just to train them in the fundamentals of offense and defense.
Big overall question, why? Why is the US actually doing this?
Just to, I don't know why.
Allow me to answer that question for him. They were training the Georgian military to attack Russia. Tensions came to a head in 2008 when the Georgian government invaded the pro-Russian separatist region of South Ossetia. Georgian forces attacked Russian peacekeepers, starting a war which Russia decisively won in 5 days. NATO apologists today call this a Russian attack, but the EU investigation into the conflict later concluded that the America-backed Georgian government had started the war. Even the EU concluded that Russia didn't start this conflict. Reuters reported in 2009, Georgia started a war with Russia, a report supported by the EU.
The EU report clearly lays the blame on Georgia, as it started bombarding Russian personnel, peacemakers in Ossetia, with heavy artillery on the night between the 7th and the 8th of August 2008. Sounds exactly like the playbook for Ukraine, with regards to the Donbass all over again, doesn't it? One key difference being that the Ukrainian Nazi battalions didn't launch artillery fire against the Russian military in the Donbass, as there weren't any such there in 2014, according to NATO Colonel Jacques Beau. The Nazis were firing at Ukrainian civilians they wanted to ethnically cleanse out of existence, which is yet another war crime supported by the Roundtable and its Faustian puppets. Case 13. The official story was that Gaddafi was mass murdering his own civilians, and we, as the good people of the West that we are, then of course had to go in and stop it. That was the feel-good narrative cooked up to stimulate NATO populations to turn the blind eye to the Roundtable's molestation and looting of Libya. But here's the truth, according to former Congressman Kurt Weldon, who was directly involved in the action at the time.
We were the ones that caused Gaddafi's death because Hillary Clinton played a game over there. And I was the one that went over there during the war. Gaddafi asked me to come over. I took a Biden staffer and a Bush staffer and a film crew leader from ABC One in New York, Larry Menti, with me, and a cameraman, because I didn't want the CIA to set me up. I hand-carried the letter back from Gaddafi offering to resign. The U.S. didn't want him to resign. They wanted to kill him.
Why?
Because Gaddafi, and I met him 3 times. I took Biden on my second trip to Libya, by the way. He went with me when I spoke to the whole country. And every meeting I had with Gaddafi, he wanted 2 things. He wanted to unite the African continent into a group of nations economically, like European standard gold, like the European economy. He wanted to base it on the gold standard. And the U.S. and Europe didn't want that. And the other thing is they wanted control of his oil, and they wanted control of his sovereign wealth. So Gaddafi had to go. That's outrageous, and it's wrong.
All these people are war criminals and should be hung after trials at the tribunal in The Hague.
A united front for the cameras and politically. The 27 leaders of the European Union states, the European Council, putting pressure on Colonel Gaddafi.
The current leadership must give up power without delay. All 27 say it loud and clear. We have the situation under constant review and will keep up the pressure.
In order to protect Libyan civilians, the European Council will consider all necessary options. There would need to be a demonstrable need, a proper legal basis from the United Nations, and regional support, namely from the Arab League.
The EU is calling for an emergency summit with the Arab League and the African Union to discuss the latest situation in Libya. But critics say it's not enough. While the talking continues, so does the fighting and the dying.
Funny how industrial-scale Islamic slave trade is not something Libyan civilians should be protected from. I guess Libyan civilians do not have the right to be protected from any long-term consequences of civil unrest internally instigated by Western intelligence agencies for entirely different reasons than the official feel-good narratives concocted for public consumption inside the Western Plato cave. Libya is now a place where extreme barbarism rules, once again. But this is apparently not something that civilians should be spared from by the good people of the West. There is also a complete mainstream media blackout on it, because NATO allies are responsible for it and are doing nothing about it and do not intend to do anything either. The removal of Gaddafi is also what has caused the subsequent Third World tsunami to roll over the West, as Gaddafi was the dam that kept it from happening, and he knew it. This dam was also a stick in the wheel of the globalist plan of nation-state weakening for later destruction in Europe.
Libya has been calling on the EU for help, but it seems those calls were ignored, and the government is now running out of patience. Libya's Interior Minister, Salah Mazek, has been quoted as threatening to facilitate the quick passage of this flood of migrants. That's if the EU fails to act. Libya accuses the migrants of spreading diseases and a surge in crime.
And I guess Libyan civilians should also just put up with the radiation poisoning from the use of uranium-depleted munitions used in civilian areas by NATO. That's how precious those Libyan civilians really were to the NATO powers. This has now been the situation in Libya ever since.
There's mayhem on the edges of Tripoli. But these forces fighting for the recognized Libyan government are getting little help from outside.
Constant civil war, and the government there desperately trying to get stability back to Libya. A government officially recognized by the West is being abandoned. Funny how little those precious civilians matter now, isn't it? And then there is this, reported by Robert Wenzel, a fellow of the Academy of Political Science and member of the American Economic Association, the History of Economic Society, and the National Association of Scholars. For some strange, inexplicable reason, it was critically important for Libyan rebels to establish a central bank in Libya, because that is the kind of thing real rebels do, right? There are more examples, many more, but you should already be catching on right about now. But if you have more examples you think are worthy of mention, put it in a comment below the video for possible discussion. Maybe I'll do a video on it. Actually, come to think of it, there might be a good case for a shared investigation here. In this clip, former Congressman Kurt Weldon, who spilled the beans on Libya, also had this to say about Afghanistan with regards to the military aftermath of 9/11.
I know what they did with Osama bin Laden after 9/11. We sent thousands of American kids to Afghanistan looking for bin Laden. 2,500 came back dead. Thousands more came back injured. Yet it was America that knew and helped place bin Laden in Baluchistan after 9/11. He was allowed to roam in Baluchistan while we sent kids to die in Afghanistan. That's outrageous. It's unacceptable. I wrote about it in my first book, and you had the date wrong, but you had the title right. The book is called Countdown to Terror. I published this book in 2005. That's why they took me out of office. The year after I wrote this book, the deep state raided my daughter's house in Philadelphia 3 weeks before my election. And you know what, Jimmy? No one ever talked to my daughter, ever. No one.
So, apparently, the roundtable interests knew all along that hunting for bin Laden in Afghanistan was a wild goose chase, because the roundtable itself had bin Laden moved to a secret compound for protection outside Afghanistan, and thus knew where bin Laden was all along. So, how many Western young men and women were allowed to die in Afghanistan from this lie? How many civilians? Mr. Weldon is someone who had his career destroyed and his family terrorized by the roundtable, because he refused to shut up when he discovered lies and omissions, so I'm inclined to believe him on this one. If you find anything related to this and it seems credible, share it in a comment below. This is also a good illustration of what usually happens if you cross the roundtable. At best, you end up as Mr. Weldon. At worst, you end up as Gaddafi, and just about no publicly elected politician is willing to suffer either fate just for you, especially if just shutting up and going along with the long game of the masters of the cave makes themselves multimillionaires, and thank you for services rendered. Remember the subsequent rewards in the business world part of the critical quote from earlier in this video? That's it. There is a challenge in all this, and it is this. When returning to the cave with facts derived from what is now a greater state of enlightenment, you are not met with gratitude, but with the arrogant scorn of the still trapped and a showering with slurs like tinfoil hat, conspiracy theorist, exactly as the masters of the cave want their perception-managed golems to respond to you. It's 1% red-pilled, trying to wake up the 98% still sleeping, with another 1%, or perhaps even less than that, trying to prevent the awakening. They already have a suitably distorted silhouette made of you, currently being held up in front of their narrative amplifiers, so these can cast a horribly disfigured shadow up on that wall in front of their golems to make the mentally captured shun you as a fringe lunatic. This is also why censorship is exploding in the West right now. The cave master can't have competing narrative amplifiers showing up to the ball to cast non-deceptive shadows from true silhouettes up on that wall next to the false ones. That just confuses the golems and will make them suspect something being wrong somehow. This is why Julian Assange and WikiLeaks is such a problem for them. It's a competing narrative amplifier casting truthful shadows in competition with the distorted ones. In another perspective, you could say that the golems are somewhat like the bird that smacks itself against a window because it thinks the window's reflection of the real world behind itself is real. So whoever controls what the bird sees mirrored in that window also controls what the bird thinks reality is. Stop being that bird. The revelations from Musk's dissection of USAID also reveals a lot about how this shadow casting is done in practice and the massive global scope of it. Unbelievable volumes of taxpayer resources are being wrongfully spent on trying to control what the masses of the world believe reality to be about anything that matters to the globalists in the fulfillment of their own long-term agenda for the whole planet. Just look at the climate crisis spending for a gross example of this. In Ukraine, great care was also taken to shut down all TV stations that didn't show the official narrative, and instead several new TV stations agendized by the roundtable mushroomed up to take their place. Clearly, that was to establish an Ukrainian Plato cave within the greater globalist cave. Yes, the holographic principle also comes into play here, as the outermost cave contains lesser caves, which again contain even lesser ones, and so on, all the way down to micro caves at the level of single individuals. This is why the USAID scandal, which validated like 10-12 different major conspiracies in one go, is so disgusting. The roundtable and its lesser tools are insidiously warping the public's perception of reality in a deliberately deceptive narrative circus in order to direct the output, being the behavior of the masses, into the direction most beneficial to the long-term agenda of the roundtable itself. Behavior, and thereby also voting, is downstream from perception. There is a lesson in that, and it is this. Whoever controls your perception input also controls your behavior output. Never forget it. Religion of peace. CO2 is a poison gas. Russians are inhumane monsters. Ukraine doesn't have a Nazi problem. On and on it goes. A good example of a smaller Plato cave within a greater one is a cult. A cult is essentially a collection of human brains that a cult leader has managed to indoctrinate into his own Plato cave for subsequent parasitic exploitation by himself. A cult is essentially just an evil-natured, egomaniacal, parasitic grift. The whole idea of golemizing the human brain to have it ensnared inside a controlled mental construct, to subsequently parasitize the energy output of its host, to redirect the energy flow towards the parasitic controller instead, is an extremely satanic idea. It's also the primary reason why Satanists are typically completely obsessed with controlling what other people think reality is, always seeking to achieve higher and higher degrees of personal empowerment over others at the expense of the mentally hijacked. This malignant dynamic also doesn't just apply to groups, it also applies to one-to-one relationships between a manipulator and a manipulated victim partner, not understanding what is going on. It's a cult of two, you could say, where one controls the reality perception of the other to the parasitic benefit of the manipulator. You often find gaslighting in these types of relationships. For those interested in the more esoteric side of the occult, you might want to look at the concept of the Black Cube, which also happens to be the name of a clandestine private sector intelligence operation controlled by the roundtable interests. The Black Cube, among other things, symbolizes the electromagnetic realm of containment that our physical forms are confined within. So instead of Plato's mind cave, it's an energetic cave for physical forms, a cave of electromagnetic confinement that can only be escaped through gnosis, which is awakening to a sufficiently high state of enlightenment and then righteously living out the achieved insights to set ourselves and others free from the lockdown of the cube. If you really want to get into this, see the link in the description. It's very esoteric, yes, but I think it's worth a watch. Even if you're not into this kind of thing, you can rest assured that the occulted parasite abusers sitting on your back are. You might say that Plato's metaphysical mind cave serves to make sure that the cube's integrity isn't compromised, and that requires keeping the golems of the cave in the dark about the bigger picture. In other words, to break the boundaries of the cube, you first have to escape the cave. The key takeaway here is that you need to be very, very careful about who you allow to program your perception of reality, who picks the silhouettes held up in front of the fire, which then produces the shadows on the wall that you and or your society end up believing is factual reality about X, Y, and Z. What might ulterior motives be? Whenever a new shadow is tossed up on that wall in front of you to make you believe something specific about whatever, build up alternative hypotheses and investigate them. Because whenever something is even remotely important to the long game of the globalistic system complex, that long game being despotic, neofeudalistic planetary control in their own technocratic hands, you will have your perception twisted and distorted as much as they require to have their own endgame served. Nothing is too low, nothing is off the table in service of their own cause. Nothing. Today, this methodology of psychological warfare is often referred to as fifth-generation warfare, a form of war where the battlefield is in our heads, and the winner is whoever is the most adept at hijacking human perception to control our behavioral output, as behavior is downstream from perception. Needless to say, psychopathy is the norm here, because nothing is off the table in war. Nothing is too low or too much. Just look at the globalist cover-up of the Islamic rape gang scandal in Britain, and the subsequent witch hunt by character assassinating all who refuse to shut up about it. Even relatives of the abused are metaphorically burned at the stake by the globalist inquisition as racists, Nazis, xenophobes, right-wing extremists, white supremacists, etc., etc. Nothing is too low for a psychopath. There is only what works and what doesn't, which is also why you must never be unwilling to do evil to evil itself, because if you are, you will lose. In the evolutionary game, whoever has the largest toolbox is also the most likely to end up standing victoriously on top of the body pile of the vanquished. And the one with the largest toolbox is the one to whom nothing is off the table. Everything is a viable option for deployment against the other. You either realize that and adjust to it, or you lose the war. In our case, the clandestine globalist war against both our national and personal sovereignties. But remember Nietzsche here. When staring down the abyss, make sure it doesn't become a part of yourself. That takes discipline and a very high degree of running personal introspection. Get to know your Jungian shadow and make it your problematic friend that just has to be dealt with in a certain way to be manageable. So why all this normie resistance to rebelling? Primarily, 6 things. 1. What I call the voter bribe package, consisting of rights, privileges, and benefits delivered by the state as the reward for continued compliance with the status quo. 2. Like I already mentioned, cowardice. 3. Cognitive ineptness, resulting in not even being able to fathom the bigger picture. 4. The lie is so big, it must be true. The bigger the lie, the more people tend to believe it. 5. The Stockholm Syndrome. 6. The end justifies the means for a perceived greater good, usually just a smokescreen alibi that people erect in front of their own egotism to conceal it under a false moral cover. To elaborate on 1, all the globalist tools in state have to do to smash all competition to themselves is to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt about voters being able to keep their collectivist bribe packages, parasitically funded with other people's money, if the other guy wins. They will even promise a fattening up of the existing bribe package to secure majority support for continuation of the current arrangement. If they can't fund it, they will just borrow the fiat from the banking interests of the roundtable, which also further strengthens the roundtable's own long game, as laid out by Professor Carol Quigley in those earlier quotes. The welfare state is just a tool of voter-corrupting social engineering to maintain their own clandestine domination by establishing existential dependency on the system for the majority of voters. It has been insidiously concocted by the globalist elitist Fabian Society as yet another cog in the Rhodes Roundtable supremacist machinery. As one of the founders of the Fabian Society, the globalist think tank that invented democratic socialism succinctly described the mechanism of voter corruption by dark incentive creation. So it's not like they don't know how to corrupt democratic majorities to vote in favor of the existing arrangement clandestinely controlled by the human farmers of the Roundtable. It was also the Fabian socialist founders of democratic socialism, not Adolf, who came up with the idea of mass gassing undesirables to death in concentration camps on industrial scale. But more on that in a later video. Winning by democracy, at least in Fabian socialistic welfare states, is not an option anymore, as the vast majority of voters in them have now made themselves existentially dependent on their bribe packages. So, how then? I will now present to you a personal action plan with 30 suggestions for anyone to consider following at their own risk. For most, it would be nearly impossible to nail all 30 suggestions for various reasons, personal and legal. But if enough people responsibly practice as many of them as possible, the globalist advance at our expense will completely implode into its own footprint. The Roundtable will crack right down the middle, and their supremacist dream will vaporize in their face. The 30-point personal action plan. So, the channel is called Abandoning the Cave because degolemizing your brain is the way to do it. There's no other way out of this than to understand that behavior is downstream from perception. So whoever controls your perception of reality also controls your behavior output, which, put together, is complete control of you. You therefore have to adjust your mental firewall appropriately to avoid ignorantly engaging in behaviors beneficial to the enemy of everything good and sane, to the detriment of yourself and others. The Roundtable is waging a clandestine war against the rest of us, and we simply have to realize it at this point. The reason why it's so difficult is because they're taking the Sun Tzu approach of trying to keep their target in ignorance about being attacked for as long as possible, as a target can only put up a self-defense if it's aware of being attacked. The longer that ignorance prevails in the target population, the easier it will be to finish it off should it finally wake up. The longer the ignorance prevails, the more progressed the state of internal weakening, and the less it will also consequently take to deliver the final blow. With a little luck, the target will just die off with a whimper, without ever realizing it was under attack, never understanding what actually happened, thinking all kinds of other reasons than the real one is the cause for their own demise. That is the dream outcome of the Roundtable in its still largely clandestine war against the rest of us. But the awakening has begun. So, we live in a day and age where the wisest default position you can take is to see democracy as a constant ongoing intelligence operation on the masses. Collectivist societies, democratic or not, always end up as a psyop on the masses at the expense of the masses themselves. That is what Plato's allegory of the cave in combination with the myth of the golem expresses so well. The thing one has to understand about evil is that it never dies. You can only temporarily beat it back whenever yet another deceptive guise concocted to deceive us into allowing it through the gateway of our minds is exposed. It simply retreats back to its grotto, does the accounting on what worked this time, what didn't, and where exactly the latest attempt went wrong. Then, when ready, it re-emerges in a more clever form than the last, and it just keeps on and on and on with this iterative process until it finally discovers a form clever enough to finally get us fooled into allowing its own supremacy over us. And we are getting very, very close to that point now, with the rainbow as its latest symbol being nothing more than a mere symbolic euphemism for the hammer and sickle. Same old wine, only the label changed. Throughout your upbringing, you have been spoon-fed this idea of Western exceptionalism, a carte blanche to break the rules and even commit gross war crimes, when doing so, not just violating outwards, but also inwards. The systemically obscured Roundtable rulers of the West, by deception, again and again, managed to make the denizens of the Anglo-globalist cave believe its own transgressive actions, parasitically funded by ourselves, are justified by a moral stature higher than the moral stature of all those it seeks to violate and subdue at everyone else's expense, in so many different ways. Well, now you know the truth. It's just not the case. And the hour is late for blowing away the latest smokescreen of faux morality, once again obscuring evil on the other side of it, and once more expel evil back to its stinking grotto. So, get up on those barricades. Evil is back, and the resistance has the minority position. It will be hard and not without personal risk, but we can still make it. Because
the masquerade is done. We now see it's all one. Just another mocking mask on the same horrid face.